Hello beautiful people, welcome to Game of Theories. In today's episode we explore what if Jon Snow was raised in Dorne as Ashara Dayne's son. Hit like, subscribe, and join our community of story lovers. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Son of Starfall, the Sword Sang. That was the only word for it, that high, clean note that rang through the training yard when Dawn connected with the practice post hard enough to split the wood clean down the grain. Not a crack, not a thud. A song, like the blade itself, was pleased with the work. Aemon pulled it back and looked at the damage. The post was done. Whoever set it into the ground this morning had done their job well, packed sand and gravel around the base, reinforced with river stones the way old Sir Edric insisted, and it hadn't mattered at all. One strike and the grain had opened like a wound. He lowered the blade and took a breath. Dawn was not a sword that tolerated half measures. It was pale as milk glass and caught the morning light in a way that made it look less like metal and more like something that had been born rather than forged, some fundamental thing that the world had decided should exist and so had shaped into a blade. Aemon had first held it when he was 9 years old, and it had nearly pulled him off his feet. He'd held it every morning since, working through the weight and the balance and the strange responsiveness of it, until it stopped feeling like a weapon he was learning and started feeling like something that already knew him. He was 16 now. "You killed another post," said a voice from the gallery above. He didn't look up. He already knew who it was by the way the syllables curved, Dornish through and through, warm and dry at the same time, like the air after a sandstorm. "Posts are made to be killed," he said. "Posts are made to be struck," Ashara Dayne corrected, descending the stone steps from the gallery with the unhurried grace of a woman who had never needed to rush anywhere and knew it. She was dressed simply for mourning, a pale shift under a loose robe the color of the deep water off the Torrentine, but there was nothing simple about the way she moved. Killing them is excess. Sir Edric says I need to learn to hold back. Sir Edric is 63 years old, and his hip has been wrong since the last time he overextended himself. She stopped at the edge of the yard and looked at the ruined post with the expression of a woman adding up numbers. Also says that about himself, and he doesn't listen either. Aemon grinned and held Dawn out flat across both palms, letting the sun hit it. In the full morning light it was almost blinding, pale and perfect and ancient. Ashara looked at it the way she always looked at it, with love and something else underneath, the love that Aemon had never quite been able to name, something complicated, something she kept behind her teeth. "The Maester came this morning," she said. "I know, I saw him cross the yard." "He brought a raven." Aemon finally looked at her directly. Her expression hadn't changed, still composed, still warm, but there was a stillness around her eyes that wasn't normally there. He'd learned to read that stillness the way sailors read the water. It meant something was coming. "From where?" he asked. "King's Landing." She let that sit for a moment then. "Robert Baratheon is coming south. He intends to spend a fortnight in Sunspear as the guest of Prince Dorne." She paused. "He's bringing the full court." Aemon turned and drove Dawn point first into the sand of the training yard, not carelessly, but deliberately, giving himself something to do with his hands. "And this concerns us because Prince Dorne has extended an invitation to the Lords of Dorne." She said it simply, like it wasn't anything. "Including House Dayne." The word "us" hung in the air between them. Aemon pulled Dawn back out of the sand, turned the blade in his hand once, and sheathed it on his back in the motion he'd been practicing since he could remember, the smooth draw and return that had been his Uncle Arthur's signature, the thing old Knight's eyes went soft remembering when they saw it on Aemon. He'd heard about those reactions. He wasn't stupid. He'd heard the whispers that came with them, too, the quick silences and the careful subject changes that happened whenever someone compared him to Arthur Dayne a little too specifically in Ashara's hearing. "When?" he asked. "A fortnight." She stepped closer and reached up without ceremony to wipe a streak of sawdust from his jaw. Her hand lingered for a second, and in that second she was just his mother, not the keeper of whatever secret lived behind her eyes, just the woman who had raised him and loved him, and occasionally driven him completely mad with her refusal to explain things. "We'll need to leave within 3 days to arrive in time." "Are you going to tell me why the expression you're wearing right now matches the one you wore when you told me about the scorpion in my boot?" She smiled. It was a real smile. He could always tell the real ones. "Because a scorpion in your boot is only dangerous if you don't see it first," she said. "Same principle applies here. The king is the scorpion. The king's court is the scorpion," she said. "The king is just the boot." Starfall sat at the mouth of the Torrentine, where the river finally exhaled itself into the summer sea, and on a clear morning you could stand on the eastern tower and see the water in both directions, brown and rushing from the mountains behind you, blue and vast ahead of you. The castle was old in the way that Dornish things were old, not worn down but worn smooth, the stone shaped by centuries of wind and salt into something almost organic, like the bones of a creature that had been lying here since before men started building. Aemon loved it the way he loved dawn, completely, without thinking about it, the way you love the things that shaped you before you understood the concept of shaping. He spent the afternoon on the eastern tower because it was the best place to think without anyone trying to help him do it. Below, he could hear the servants beginning the business of preparing for travel, crates being dragged across cobblestones, horses moved from one paddock to another, Sir Edric's voice rising and falling in the specific cadence of a man who has opinions about how things should be packed. Aemon sat on the parapet with his back against the stone and his knees up and thought about the king of the 7 kingdoms coming to Dorne. He knew the history. You couldn't grow up in Dorne and not know the history, because Dorne had a very specific relationship with the word history that involved treating it less as past events and more as a wound you were keeping track of. Robert Baratheon had crushed the Targaryen dynasty. He had killed Rhaegar on the Trident. His soldiers had killed Elia Martell and her children in the Red Keep. Dorne remembered. Dorne would always remember, and Robert was coming south. Doran Martell would receive him because Dorne was a cautious man who played long games and chose peace over the satisfaction of principle. Aemon had met Dorne twice and found him difficult to read in a way that he respected. The man was like deep water, still on the surface and doing whatever it wanted underneath. It was Oberyn Martell who was the problem, or the solution, depending on your vantage point. Aemon had met Oberyn 4 times, the last being at a merchant feast in Planky Town 2 summers past. Oberyn had spent the entire evening watching him with the expression of a man who was deciding something, and at the end of the night, when the wine had made everyone else loose and easy, he had leaned across the table and said very quietly, "You move like Arthur." "Has anyone ever told you that?" Aemon had said no, because Ashara was sitting 3 chairs down and he'd seen her go still. Oberyn had smiled and let it go, but he hadn't forgotten. Aemon could tell that about him. Prince Oberyn Martell did not forget things he decided were interesting. "Thought I'd find you up here." He turned. Sierra, the second daughter of his mother's household steward, was climbing the last of the steps with the ease of someone who'd been climbing them since childhood, which she had. She was a year younger than Aemon, dark-eyed and quick, and she had the specific quality of being one of the only people at Starfall who treated him exactly the same whether Dawn was on his back or not. "Does my mother know you're up here? Your mother sent me." Sierra dropped onto the parapet beside him with no ceremony and looked out at the sea. "She wants to know if you're going to eat before you spiral all the way into yourself." "I'm not spiraling. You've got your spiral face on." "Don't have a—" He stopped because arguing about expressions with Sierra was a war you couldn't win. "Tell her I'll come down. She also wants you to know that Sir Edric's arguments about what you should bring to Sunspear are going to outlast the sun, and she'd appreciate your help containing them." Sierra glanced at Dawn where it rested against the stone beside him. The sword caught the afternoon light differently than morning light, amber now instead of white, like something half-remembered. "Are you bringing it?" "It goes where I go. People are going to stare. People always stare." He picked it up and stood. "That's their concern." Sierra looked at him for a second with the measuring look she occasionally got, the one that made her seem older than her age. "Aemon, are you actually all right about this?" He thought about it honestly, which was something he could do with Sierra that he couldn't always do with others. "I'm not afraid of it," he said. "I just want to understand what we're walking into before we walk into it. That's just your spiral face with better vocabulary." He laughed genuinely, and it broke the weight of the afternoon. "Come on," he said, heading for the steps. "Let's go stop Sir Edric from packing his entire armory." They left Starfall on a Tuesday, before the worst of the morning heat. Ashara rode at the head of the column on a pale mare she'd owned for 9 years, and refused to replace despite the horse being, by any objective measure, extremely stubborn. Aemon rode beside her on a grey gelding that had cost him 3 months of careful trade talk at the Planky Town market and was worth every copper. 20 riders from the Starfall garrison rode behind them, along with 2 wagons of tribute gifts and Sir Edric, who was still complaining about what had been left behind. The road to Sunspear ran east along the coast and then inland through the dunes of the Torrentine lowlands, and Aemon spent the first day riding in comfortable silence with his mother, watching the landscape change. He loved Dorne like this, not the politics of it, not the history, but the physical fact of it. The way the stone was red and the sky was impossibly blue, and the plants that survived here did it with a kind of defiant energy, pushing thorns and flowers out of sand that had no business supporting them. Second night camped in a dry valley with a good well and a fire that fought the desert cold. Ashara came to sit beside him and stared into the flames for a long time without saying anything. He waited. "You're going to encounter people at Sunspear," she finally said, "who will ask you questions about your father. They already ask. I tell them my father died at the Tower of Joy. Yes, she turned the ring on her middle finger. She always did that when she was working something out, which is true. But some of them will probe further. He looked at her. Do you want to tell me something about that? The fire popped. She watched it. Not yet, she said. But I want you to understand that when the time comes, and it may come sooner than either of us would prefer, I will tell you everything. She finally looked at him. I swear that to you, not as your mother, as Ashara Dayne on Arthur's memory. She didn't swear on Arthur's memory lightly. Aemon had heard her do it twice in his life, both times when the thing she was saying was the most important thing she'd ever said. All right, he said. She looked back at the fire. Something in her shoulders released slightly, like a sail catching wind. The boy I want you to be careful of, she said, shifting to the tone she used for political instruction, warm but specific. The way a good blade is specific, is Joffrey Baratheon, the prince, the heir, 12 years old and already a problem. She shook her head slightly. His mother has raised him to believe that his comfort is the world's obligation. He enjoys provoking people and watching them manage themselves for his entertainment. Sounds exhausting. Yes, well. The exhausting ones are always the dangerous ones, because no one takes them seriously until they've done something serious. She leaned back on her hands. Don't be baited. I'm not going to be baited by a 12-year-old. You're going to want to put him face first in the sand, and I need you not to do that. Aemon was quiet for a second. What if he deserves it? Ashara's expression shifted into something that was almost amusement. Most people who deserve it are the most dangerous ones to give it to. She stood up, brushing sand from her robe. Go to sleep. We have 2 more days of riding, and I'd like at least one of them to pass without Sir Edric finding something new to complain about. He found a scorpion in his blanket this morning. Yes, and he'll be describing it until we die. She bent and pressed a kiss to the top of his head, the way she had when he was small and the world had been easier. Sleep, Aemon. He watched her walk back to her tent and then looked up at the sky. The stars were extraordinary out here in the open desert, dense and close and uncountable. The kind of sky that made you feel like the ground beneath you was the only solid thing in the universe. He found the star that Sir Edric had shown him years ago, the one that sailors used to navigate, fixed and unmoving while everything else wheeled around it. He looked at it for a long time before he slept. Sunspear was not subtle. Where Starfall was smooth and old and shaped by the sea, Sunspear was aggressive, towers that reached for the sky like they were angry at it, walls the color of rust and gold, the sandship pushing out from the main castle like a fist. The shadow it threw across the approaching road was long even in afternoon, and the banners of House Martell snapped at every parapet, the sun and spear in brilliant yellow. They arrived on the 4th day, and the city outside the walls was already swollen with the traffic of arriving lords. Aemon could see banners from half the houses of Dorne hanging from market stalls and in windows, and the road itself was thick with riders and wagons, creating the specific chaos of too many important people arriving at the same place. Aemon rode through it with his hand loose at his side and his eyes moving, cataloging. Stop doing that, Sira said from behind him. Doing what? The thing where you look like you're making a battle plan. I'm not making a battle plan. Your eyes are making a battle plan. He filed away the information they'd gathered. 6 banners of minor Dornish lordlings he recognized. 2 he didn't. A contingent of gold cloaks from King's Landing in the red and gold livery that looked obscenely bright against the Dornish stone. A line of wheelhouses with Lannister lions on the side, which meant the Lannisters had come in force, and let his face settle into something more neutral. The gates opened for House Dayne without difficulty. A Martell steward in orange and red livery met them at the inner courtyard and bowed deeply to Ashara, the specific depth of a man who knows exactly where House Dayne sits in the Dornish hierarchy. My Lady of Starfall, he straightened and his eyes moved to Aemon with undisguised curiosity. And your son, Prince Dorne, bid me tell you that your chambers are prepared in the Tower of the Sun and that he looks forward to your presence at dinner this evening. Thank him for us, Ashara said, dismounting with the fluid ease that made it look effortless. We'll rest before dinner. The steward's eyes drifted to the sword on Aemon's back, pale, bright, unmistakable, and for one unguarded moment his expression moved through several things very quickly. Recognition, reverence, and something underneath both that Aemon couldn't entirely read. Then the steward looked away and began directing their baggage. Aemon swung down from the grey gelding and stood in the courtyard of Sunspear, and the afternoon heat pressed down on him like a hand, and somewhere in the castle ahead of him, he could hear the distant noise of hundreds of people going about the business of power, laughing, arguing, playing the game that Dorne played and the rest of Westeros played, and that seemed to Aemon, when he thought about it honestly, like a very expensive way to make everyone miserable. He adjusted Dawn on his back and followed his mother inside. Oberyn Martell found them before dinner. He came without ceremony, which was typical of Oberyn. He was a man who found ceremony tedious and had enough status to ignore it without consequence. He appeared in the corridor outside their chambers while Aemon was still in traveling clothes, with Ellaria Sand at his shoulder and 3 of his daughters trailing behind at various distances of attention. Aemon had met Ellaria twice before. She was warm in the specific way of a person who is warm because they've chosen to be rather than because they can't help it, deliberate warmth, the kind that meant something. She smiled at him now with genuine pleasure. Oberyn was looking at him the way he'd looked at him in Planky Town. That deciding something look, except now the decision seemed further along. The son of Starfall, Oberyn said by way of greeting, and he made it sound like a title rather than an identification. Prince Oberyn. Aemon inclined his head, not a full bow, just the acknowledgement of rank that Dornish custom required between equals of similar standing. He'd thought about the degree of that inclination more than he would admit. Oberyn noticed. He noticed everything. His eyes lit up just slightly at the corners. "You've grown," he said, "since Planky Town. 2 years will do that. 2 years and a great deal of work." The prince's eyes moved to Dawn with the frank appreciation of a man who knew weapons. "You've been practicing, every morning, with that." Oberyn took a half step forward and looked at the blade with something that wasn't quite reverence. Oberyn wasn't built for reverence exactly, but was deeply respectful. "I knew Arthur Dayne," he said more quietly. "He was the finest swordsman I ever saw, and I've seen many." He looked back at Aemon's face. He held that blade like it was an extension of his arm, like it chose him. "That's how it feels when you hold it," Aemon said honestly. Something crossed Oberyn's face, fast, there and gone. He turned to Ashara, who had emerged from the chamber doorway and was watching this exchange with the careful stillness of someone managing a very complicated situation. "Ashara," he said, and there was 10 years of shared history in a single word. "Oberyn," she returned. They looked at each other. Aemon watched both their faces and learned absolutely nothing, which meant they were both very good at this. "We should drink together before dinner," Oberyn said. "I find Dornish politics are best approached with an honest amount of arbor gold." He glanced at Aemon. "Bring the boy. He's 16, Ashara said, and carrying a sword that most men can't lift. He can have a cup of wine." Oberyn was already turning. "Ellaria," he said, and Ellaria touched Ashara's arm gently and steered them both forward with the efficiency of a woman used to managing men who were simultaneously too large and too confident for any given room. They ended up in a solar off the Martell family wing, lower than the state rooms, more comfortable, with rugs on the floor and cushions on the seats and a table with wine and a plate of dates and dried figs. Oberyn's daughters dispersed themselves around the room with the easy grace of young women who had grown up in every room of this castle. Obara, the eldest, sat in the window with a cup and looked at Aemon with the measuring expression of someone deciding whether to approve. Nymeria was reading something and only looked up occasionally. Tyene, the youngest present, was watching Aemon with the specific attentiveness of a cat watching a bird that might be interesting. Aemon sat, accepted wine, and waited. Oberyn didn't make people wait long. He was too impatient himself. "Robert Baratheon arrives tomorrow," he said, settling into the seat across from Aemon with the controlled ease of a man who had trained his body the way Aemon trained his. "Cersei Lannister and their children and Tywin Lannister himself, which tells me that whoever organized this visit was not thinking about it as a social call. Tywin Lannister manages his son's court," Ashara said. "He wouldn't come south for a social call." Oberyn turned his cup slowly. "He'd come south to do something he can only do in person, which means there's a negotiation he wants to conduct face-to-face away from King's Landing." He looked at Aemon. "What do you make of that?" Aemon took a breath. This was the kind of conversation Ashara had been training him for since he was 10, not weapons practice, not the physical training, but this. The reading of rooms and people and situations. "He wants something from Dorne," he said. "Something Dorne has or can offer that Tywin can't get through the usual channels. Such as alliance. Dorne has stayed independent in ways that make the rest of Westeros uncomfortable. If Tywin can tie Dorne to the Iron Throne through a marriage or a trade compact, he stabilizes the South." He thought about it. It would also mean Dorne stops being a variable he can't control. Oberyn looked at him for a long, weighing moment, then he turned to Ashara. "He's quicker than his face lets on." "He always has been," Ashara said, in a tone that carried a complicated kind of pride. "The question," Aemon continued, because he was already in it, "is what Dorne wants to give Tywin in exchange for whatever Tywin's offering, and whether what Tywin's offering is worth the price Dorne would pay for accepting it." "Dorne plays a long game," Oberyn said. "Longer than Tywin's." Oberyn's smile was slow and genuinely delighted. That young Dane is exactly the right question. He drank. My brother keeps his plans close and his timetable close. I don't always agree with his pace. He set down the cup, but I've learned to trust that there's a reason for it. Outside, the sun was sinking, turning the walls of Sunspear the color of old bronze. Aemon could hear the castle around him settling into the rhythms of evening, kitchens working, horses being stabled, voices at a distance. Sir Arthur, Oberyn said, and the room changed, not dramatically, just a small shift in temperature. Ashara went still again. Your uncle, I think about him often. I didn't know him, Aemon said, careful, honest, number you wouldn't have. Oberyn was looking at him again. But I watched him fight once at a tourney in King's Landing, when we were young men and the world was different. He unhorsed 8 nights in a row and never looked like he was trying. He paused. When you picked up that blade in the corridor, I saw something. He let that sentence end and didn't finish it, which was its own kind of finishing. Ashara said Sir Edric trained him. Sir Edric is a fine instructor, Oberyn said evenly, but instruction doesn't produce what I saw. He stood, which ended that line of conversation as cleanly as a sword cut. Dinner in an hour, the court will be present. Dorne is holding the formal welcome feast. Dress well, Aemon. First impressions in rooms like that are the only impressions that matter. He left with Ilaria, his daughters peeling away from their various corners and following. Obara paused at the door and looked at Aemon one more time, not hostile, just assessing, and then she was gone too. Aemon sat in the quiet room with the last of the light coming through the windows and his mother sitting across from him with the expression she'd been wearing all day. He knows something, Aemon said. Oberyn always knows something. About me specifically. Ashara looked at him. Then she stood, smoothed her robes, and said, go get dressed for dinner. Wear the dark red, it suits you and it's appropriate for Dornish court. She moved toward the door, and Aemon, yes, bring Dawn, he blinked. That was unexpected. Bringing a weapon to a feast wasn't standard, even in Dorne. Are you expecting trouble? I'm expecting people to look at you, she said, and I want them to look at all of you. She met his eyes. Let them see who you are. She left him with that, and Aemon Dayne sat alone in the last light of the Dornish evening and thought about what it meant to be seen. The feast was loud and bright and enormous. Doran Martell held his formal welcoming dinners in the great hall of the Spear Tower, which was built for exactly this purpose. The long table that ran its length could seat 200, and tonight there were close to that many. Candles blazing in iron stands. The smell of spiced lamb and saffron rice and the heavy sweetness of Dornish dates. Music from a corner, not intrusive, just enough to fill the edges of sound. Aemon entered with Ashara at his left and Dawn on his back and felt the room adjust. It was subtle, not a gasp or a silence, just a small collective shift, the way water moves when something enters it. Eyes moved to them, paused on the sword, moved away with the carefully managed neutrality of people trying not to be caught staring. He walked with Ashara to their assigned seats, good placement, near Doran's end of the table, which told him something about how House Dayne stood in Doran's current thinking, and settled in and looked down the table. Doran Martell sat at the head in his wheeled chair, dressed in formal orange and red, and he met Aemon's eyes from that distance with the stillness of deep water and inclined his head once. Aemon returned it. Doran had the face of a man who slept very little and thought about everything, and when he looked at Aemon, he looked at him the same way he looked at everyone, like he was a piece in a game that Doran had been playing since before Aemon was born. The Lannister contingent was across the table and 2/3 down, easy to spot by the gold, of which there was a great deal, as if the Lannisters felt that wealth was best deployed by wearing all of it simultaneously. Tywin Lannister sat with the stillness of a man who has not needed to prove anything in decades. He was watching the room the way Aemon had been watching it, and when his eyes reached Aemon they stopped for exactly 1 second longer than they stopped on anyone else. Aemon met his gaze, didn't smile. Didn't look away, just returned the look with the uncomplicated directness of someone who had nothing to justify. Tywin's eyes moved on. Cersei Lannister was beautiful in the way that made you aware of it against your will. It announced itself and demanded acknowledgement. She was looking at Aemon with something calculating and refined, her head slightly tilted, the way you look at a painting when you're trying to decide if it's genuine. And then there was Joffrey. He was 12, as Ashara had said. Fair-haired, pleasant-featured in the way that wouldn't last, already carrying himself with the specific posture of a boy who has never once been told no in a way that stuck. He was next to his mother and he was bored, the particular aggressive boredom of a child who wants everyone to know he finds them beneath him. His eyes hit on Aemon and the sword and he leaned to his mother and said something. Cersei's expression didn't change, but she put one hand lightly on his arm in a gesture that said not yet. Aemon looked away from them both and reached for his wine. "The Lannister boy is looking at you," Sira murmured from his right, which hadn't been in the seating plan but which Aemon had adjusted because Sira had a gift for observation, and he found her useful at exactly this kind of occasion. "I know. He looks like he wants to say something unpleasant. He probably does. Are you going to let him?" Aemon took a long drink of wine and set the cup down. "Let him get it out of his system," he said pleasantly. "It's usually the first one that costs you. After that you know what you're dealing with." Sir Edric on Ashara's other side leaned forward slightly and said, "The boys heard about the sword. Garrison lads are talking about it outside. Said the young Lord Dayne rode in with Dawn on his back like he'd been born with it." "He practically was," Ashara said dryly. Aemon ignored all of this and ate, which was the appropriate response to a feast, and listened to the conversations around him, which was the appropriate response to a room full of people who thought they were being private. It was midway through the second course that it happened. Joffrey's voice carried because he didn't know how to make it not. It was the voice of a boy who had grown up in rooms where everyone stopped talking when he spoke. "Why does he have a sword at table?" The question was directed at no one and everyone, cast into the air of the hall. Silence spread from him like ripples. "Isn't that improper? Father says." "My father's house has different customs than yours," Aemon said without looking up from his plate. He said it the way you'd comment on the weather, conversational, direct, finished. The silence deepened. He looked up then because he'd said it to be heard and there was no point not seeing if it landed. Joffrey's face was doing several things at once. He hadn't expected an answer. He'd expected apology or nervous deflection or the specific flavor of discomfort that he had apparently decided was his birthright. "And who are you?" Joffrey said with the too loud certainty of someone trying to recover ground. "Aemon Dayne of Starfall," he said, "your host's guest, as are you." Cersei's hand moved on her son's arm again, a fractional motion, barely visible. Joffrey's jaw tightened. A few seats down, Aemon could hear someone who sounded very much like Oberyn Martell laughing quietly into his wine. "That sword," Joffrey said, and there was something hungry in his voice now, the way certain boys get when they want a thing they haven't been given permission to want. "Is that Dawn?" "It is." "Can I?" "No," Aemon said, returning to his food. The silence that followed lasted about 3 full seconds before the table conversation rushed back in to fill it, the way water fills a space that's been cleared. And Aemon ate his lamb and paid attention to nothing else and felt the warmth of his mother's presence beside him and the distant, satisfied quality of Oberyn Martell's continued laughter from down the table. Later, when the courses had given way to music and small groups forming and reforming in the way of late-night feasts, Oberyn appeared at Aemon's shoulder with a cup of wine for himself and a renewed cup for Aemon. "Well," he said, settling beside him with the ease of a man installing himself wherever he likes. "That could have gone considerably worse. It could have gone considerably better," Ashara said from Aemon's other side. "You told him not to be baited," Oberyn observed. "He wasn't baited. He redirected a provocation with 8 words and made a prince look petulant without raising his voice." He tilted his head toward Aemon. "That's not being baited. That's something more interesting." Aemon looked at him. "Which is?" Oberyn's expression was the one from Planky Town, the deciding something one, except now the decision was made. "Knowing exactly who you are," he said, and not needing anyone else to confirm it. He raised his cup. "House Dayne, young man." "As it has always been," he drank, "and a few other things besides." He moved away before Aemon could ask him what he meant into the crowd of the feast and was gone like smoke into a draught. Aemon stood in the noise of the hall and held his cup and looked up through the high windows of the Spear Tower at the sky, where the same stars that hung over Starfall hung over Sunspear, and thought about all the things that the people around him knew and weren't saying. He was 16 years old and standing in the middle of a game whose rules he hadn't been given yet. He could feel the shape of it, though. The way you feel a blade before it reaches you, a disturbance in the air, a displacement, something coming toward you that isn't visible but is absolutely real. He adjusted Dawn on his back, the hilt warm against his fingers, and waited for the world to show him what it wanted. Chapter 2. Vipers and Stars. Robert Baratheon arrived the way storms arrived, with noise, with force, with the absolute confidence of something that had never once been told it couldn't go exactly where it was going. The procession was enormous. Aemon watched it from the second-floor gallery above the main courtyard, elbows on the stone railing, and counted banners the way Sir Edric had taught him to count enemy forces, not the obvious ones at the front, but the ones tucked in the middle, the ones you had to look for. Gold cloaks, Lannister outriders, the crowned stag on black snapping from a dozen poles. And in the middle of it all, Robert himself on a destrier that looked like it was regretting its life choices, a massive man gone thick around the middle but still carrying in his arms and shoulders the evidence of what he'd been 20 years ago. a hammer. A force of nature that had personally killed the last dragon prince and worn that fact ever since like a second crown. He was laughing when he came through the gates. Some joke, someone riding beside him. Aemon couldn't hear the words but could hear the quality of the laugh, big and expansive, and the kind that expected the room to laugh with it. Several people were, in the obedient way of men around powerful kings. Doran Martell was waiting in the courtyard in his chair, flanked by Oberyn and a line of Dornish lords, and the expression on Doran's face was the same expression Doran seemed to keep for all occasions, measured, composed, giving away exactly nothing. Oberyn stood with his arms loosely crossed and his chin slightly up and his face carrying the particular quality of a man maintaining a position with great deliberate effort, the way you hold a rope that wants to slip. The king swung off the horse with the practiced ease of a man who had been doing it for decades even if the ease cost him something now, and strode to Doran with his arms wide. Doran, big voice. The courtyard carried it up to where Aemon stood. God's man, this heat, how do you stand it? We were born to it, your grace. Doran's voice was quieter, as it always was, and it made Robert have to lean in slightly to hear him, which was, Aemon was fairly certain, intentional. Welcome to Sunspear, always a magnificent place. Robert looked up and around at the towers and battlements with the unguarded appreciation of a man who loves impressive buildings because they remind him of himself. His eyes swept the gallery and passed over Aemon without stopping, just another face in the crowd, and moved on. Aemon watched him complete the greeting ceremony with Doran, exchange words with Oberyn that lasted exactly as long as was required and no longer, both men smiling with their mouths and not much else, and thought about the machinery underneath all of this. The Martells hated this man. Robert had held a feast on the day Elia was buried, by certain account. He had picked up the Iron Throne and gone on ruling and expected everyone to accept it, the way the strong always expected the weak to accept what had been done to them. And here Doran was, receiving him in his own hall, smiling. The long game, Oberyn had said. Aemon was beginning to understand that the long game required a very specific kind of stomach. You look thoughtful, said a voice beside him. He turned. A girl had appeared on the gallery, a young woman, technically, perhaps a year younger than him, with the dark eyes and olive skin of Dorne and her hair in one long braid over her shoulder. He recognized her after a moment, Tyene Sand, Oberyn's youngest present daughter who had been at the feast last night watching him with cat eyes. Up close she was prettier than he'd registered and carried herself with a deliberate softness that he instinctively didn't trust in the way he didn't trust deliberately soft things. Studying the new arrivals, he said. She leaned on the railing beside him, unconcerned with personal space in the Dornish way. My father does that too. Counts them, figures out what they mean. She glanced at him sideways. What do you make of the king? Exactly what he looks like, Aemon said, which I suspect is the point. He wants to look like a simple man who enjoys simple things so that you forget he killed his way to the throne. Tyene made a small sound of appreciation. And Lord Tywin, the opposite. He wants to look like the most complicated man in the room so that you focus on the complexity and miss the simple thing, which is that everything he does is about Lannister permanence. And what about us? She tilted her head. What does a Lannister see when he looks at Dorne? A variable, he said. Something not yet controlled, which is worse than an enemy from Tywin's perspective, an enemy you know, a variable you don't. Tyene looked at him with the measuring expression that seemed to be a family trait among Oberyn's daughters. Then she smiled, and the smile was warmer than the calculation that preceded it. My father says you're interesting, she said. He doesn't say that about many people. How many? Me, she said, counting on her fingers. Nymeria, Obara, obviously, but I'm not sure that's the same kind of interesting. Elaria, Maester Caliot on his better days. She tilted her head. You, as of 2 days ago. She straightened up from the railing. He wants to train with you, before the king's party gets settled and the real business starts. He said to find you this morning if you were awake. I've been awake since before sunrise. So has he. She was already moving toward the stairs. Well, or do you want to keep watching the courtyard? Aemon took one last look at Robert Baratheon below, now moving inside with his host, his laughing voice still audible even as he disappeared through the archway. Then he pushed off the railing and followed Tyene. The training yard at Sunspear was larger than Starfall's and better equipped, which made sense. Sunspear housed a garrison and Starfall housed a memory. There were racks of practice weapons along one wall and a sand floor raked clean in the early morning, and the light coming in from the east at the angle that meant it was still early enough to be useful before the heat made everything difficult. Oberyn was already there. He was shirtless and doing something that wasn't quite calisthenics and wasn't quite a weapon's form, a series of controlled movements, slow enough to see the muscle work, the kind of thing that looked easy until you tried it and discovered it was the opposite. Finished when he heard them arrive and turned and picked up 2 practice spears from the rack with the thoughtless ease of a man for whom weapons are extensions of himself. He threw one to Aemon without warning. Aemon caught it, not because he'd been expecting it, but because his hands always knew before the rest of him. 3 years of Dawn training had made him into something that moved faster than its own thinking in the moments that mattered. Oberyn noticed. "Good," he said simply. "I don't fight with a spear." "You fight with what's in your hand." Oberyn moved to the center of the yard. "Come." Aemon looked at the spear, which was a proper practice weapon, the weight and balance of a real one just blunted at the tip. He looked at Oberyn, who was standing in the open yard with the loose-limbed confidence of a man who had been fighting with a spear since before Aemon was born. Then he moved forward. What followed was not a lesson, exactly. Oberyn didn't explain anything. He attacked and Aemon responded, and when Aemon made a mistake, which he did, twice in the first minute, once getting caught flat-footed and once overcommitting to a parry, Oberyn didn't comment on it, just used it and moved on. The sand under their feet shifted and settled. The morning light came further into the yard. Aemon figured out the spear in stages. The reach was different from Dawn, longer, and the center of mass sat differently, so your defensive instincts from sword work were actively wrong in ways that were interesting rather than discouraging. He started treating it as a problem to solve in real time and stopped trying to apply what he knew from a different weapon, and after about 10 minutes something clicked into place and he stopped getting caught by the same moves twice. Oberyn felt it too. Aemon could see it in how he adjusted, came at him differently, pushed the new edges rather than the old ones. They went for 20 minutes before Oberyn stepped back and planted the spear butt in the sand. "You adapt quickly," he said. He wasn't particularly winded, which was impressive for a man of his age doing what he'd just been doing. Most trained swordsmen lose the first 3 minutes with an unfamiliar weapon. First 3 minutes is a long time in a fight. Yes, it is. Oberyn turned toward the water basin along the wall and poured a ladle over the back of his neck. Arthur was the same. Pick up anything, and within moments it belonged to him. He was facing away, so Aemon couldn't see his expression. "I used to think that was an Arthur quality, a Dane thing." He turned back. "Now I'm less certain." Aemon held the practice spear at his side and said nothing. Waiting. "Your mother is a remarkable woman," Oberyn said conversationally, "and a remarkable liar. She keeps her counsel," Aemon said carefully. "Yes." Oberyn took a drink of water from the basin's cup. "There's something I've wondered for 16 years, he said. "Something that I've been wondering with increasing urgency since the last time I saw you, and with absolute focused intensity since you walked into the feast last night with Dawn on your back and a face like—" He stopped himself, which was unusual for Oberyn, who did not generally stop himself. He looked at Aemon. "How old are you exactly?" 16, born in the year of the Tower of Joy," Oberyn said quietly. The yard went very still. Tyene, who had been leaning against the far wall watching, went absolutely quiet. Aemon felt something move through him, not fear, because he didn't frighten easily, but a kind of heightened attention, like the air before lightning. "Yes," he said. Oberyn looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "Ashara did not have a relationship with any man in the months before the Tower of Joy fell that could account for you." He said it plainly, without accusation. "I was at court, I knew the players, there was no one." He paused. Except, Aemon said, equally plain. "She was there," Oberyn said, "at the end, with Lyanna Stark." He was still looking at Aemon with the expression of a man laying out pieces on a board and watching where they fall. Ned Stark rode to the Tower of Joy, and 3 of the Kingsguard were there, including Arthur. He said his name without ceremony, just a fact. Ned rode away with a baby he claimed as his bastard, and Ashara Dayne disappeared from court and turned up at Starfall 8 months later with a son. "People disappear in wartime," Aemon said. "They do," Oberyn agreed. "And sometimes the things they bring back with them are more than grief." He stepped forward until he was close enough that his voice didn't need to carry. "I'm not going to press you, Aemon. I'm not going to demand an answer you're not ready to give, but I want you to understand something." His voice was absolutely level. "If what I think happened is what happened, if you are who I believe you might be, then the man sitting on the throne 1 floor above us has a very specific reason to want you dead." The weight of that landed simply, without drama, which somehow made it heavier. "I know," Aemon said. Oberyn looked at him sharply. "You know. I've known for a year that something is being kept from me. I know it involves the Tower of Joy, and I know it involves Lyanna Stark, and I know that my mother refuses to confirm or deny it with a specificity that is itself a kind of answer." He met Oberyn's eyes. "I'm not stupid and I'm not a child." Oberyn studied him. Then he laughed, a real laugh, low and genuine. "No," he said, "you are absolutely not." He stepped back. "Then let me tell you what I intend to do with what I believe, which is nothing, until you're ready and until the time is right." He picked up his spear, and in the meantime again from the top, this time with the full grip. Aemon looked at the practice weapon in his hand and adjusted his grip and followed Oberyn back to the center of the yard. They trained for another hour. When they finished, neither of them spoke about what had passed between them because it had been said and there was nothing more to add to it yet, and Aemon walked back through the castle with Tyne at his shoulder, and his mind working through the implications like water finding a channel, steady and inevitable. The political business of the visit began that afternoon in the formal receiving chambers of the Tower of the Sun. Aemon wasn't invited to those rooms. He was 16, the lord of a secondary Dornish house, and the negotiations between Dorne and Tywin were not his concern, but Ashara was as one of the senior Dornish lords, and she went with her usual composure and left Aemon to navigate the afternoon. He used it to explore. Sunspear was large enough to get lost in if you didn't know it, and Aemon had been here often enough that he knew the main corridors but not the connecting passages and servant routes. He spent an hour in the library, smaller than Starfall's, more recently curated, heavy on Dornish history and navigation charts, and then drifted out through a side corridor that ran along the back of the formal rooms and put him, without planning it, near a window that looked into an internal garden where Robert Baratheon was sitting with a cup of wine and a man Aemon recognized as Sir Barristan Selmy, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. He would have moved on except he heard his name. Not his name Dayne, but close enough to stop him. "Dayne boy," Robert was saying in the outdoor voice of a man who didn't think about walls. "Did you see the sword they let a boy carry Dawn?" "Arthur Dayne's sword. It's his family sword, your grace," Sir Barristan said evenly. "House Dayne, it belongs there." Arthur Dayne. Robert said the name with a complicated weight, not quite respect, not quite resentment, something in between that only made sense if you fought against someone and found them genuinely hard to beat. "God's that man. Do you know I used to have nightmares about fighting him. Before Barristan, don't give me that look, before the war. I was young and everyone said Dayne was the finest sword alive, and I used to think about what that would be like." He drank. "Never had to find out as it happened. Ned dealt with that. Lord Stark dealt with the Kingsguard, yes. 3 of them, wasn't it? Dawn, the gods, and plain luck, Ned always said." Robert was quiet for a moment. "Always wondered what happened to Dayne's sister. Pretty woman. Stark had some business with her, I think. I believe she retired to Starfall, your grace. The boy is her son." Robert didn't sound particularly interested. "Strange-looking boy, too pale for Dorne. Has that sword, though. Remarkable thing." Another drink. "Who was the father?" "I don't know, your grace. Probably some Dornish lordling. They're all cousins down here anyway." He laughed at his own joke. "Fine. What time is dinner?" Aemon stood at the window for a moment after they moved away, holding that conversation in his head, turning it over. Too pale for Dorne. Robert had noticed and filed it as irrelevant, the way a man notices something that doesn't fit and then decides the thing that doesn't fit isn't interesting enough to investigate. That was the armor Ashara had built around him, Aemon realized. Not just distance and a different name. The sheer audacity of standing in plain sight. Because the thing about Robert Baratheon, who had crushed the Targaryens and killed Rhaegar and lived for 16 years with the comfort of a completed job, the thing about a man like that was that he didn't look for surviving complications. He didn't need to, he'd won. Aemon moved away from the window and walked back through the corridors of Sunspear and thought about what it meant to be a surviving complication. The second feast was louder than the first. Robert's presence changed the sound of a room the way a large fire changed the temperature. You felt it everywhere, not just near the source. He was at the head of the table beside Doran, the two of them in conversation that looked genuine from a distance and was probably not, and the table filled in both directions with a mixture of Dornish lords and Lannister courtiers that was either ambitious hospitality or Doran's idea of a controlled experiment. Aemon was placed further down the table tonight, still good positioning, but different, and he had to look up the length of it to see the main players. He used the distance to watch rather than engage. Cersei Lannister was present and dressed in gold that made her look like she'd been assembled rather than born, every element calculated. She spent most of the meal looking at the room with the particular quality of attention that Aemon associated with people doing their own version of what he was doing, counting, assessing, deciding. She caught him looking once. Instead of looking away, she held his gaze for 3 seconds and then moved her eyes past him with the deliberateness of someone choosing not to make something of it yet. "She's decided you're worth watching," Nymeria Sand said from his left. She'd appeared without introduction, which seemed to be how Oberyn's daughters operated. Is she always like that? Like what? Like she's the only real person in the room and everyone else is furniture. Nymeria's mouth curved. "The Lannisters think the world is theirs," she said with the specific Dornish inflection that made things sound like the most devastating word in the language. She thinks it too, just better than most. She poured herself wine. You should know she asked Dorne about you this morning. What did she ask? Who your father was. Aemon kept his expression exactly where it was. What did Dorne say? He told her Ashara Dayne had never disclosed the father's identity, which is true. Nymeria looked at him sideways. She wasn't satisfied. She wouldn't be. Number Cersei Lannister is not a woman who accepts "I don't know" as an answer. She just goes and finds out through different means. Nymeria reached past him for the dates. My advice, for whatever it's worth from someone who's known you 3 days, be boring to her specifically. Beautiful people with famous swords and mysterious parentage are interesting to Cersei. Interesting things she can't control make her dangerous. I'm not afraid of her. I didn't say be afraid of her, Nymeria said patiently. I said be boring, those are different things. She ate a date and looked back at the table. Also, Joffrey is going to try again tonight. He's been telling the other children about you all day. Children. There's a small pack of lordling sons who follow him around. He's been building himself up by tearing you down, which is what he does with things he can't have. She glanced at Dawn where it rested against the bench beside Aemon. He never put it out of reach, never propped it somewhere across the room. He really wants the sword. Everyone wants the sword. Yes, but most people are polite about it. She shrugged. Just be ready. She turned away into a conversation with the Dornish lord on her other side, and Aemon ate his dinner and waited, and was not kept waiting long. Joffrey came to him rather than shouting down the table this time, which showed some learning. He appeared at Aemon's elbow between courses with 2 of his trailing pack, boys his age, both with the carefully arranged faces of people pretending they aren't there on instruction, and looked at Dawn with the hunger of a boy who has been told no and can't understand why. I want to hold it, he said without preamble. The sword. No, Aemon said. Do you know who I am? Joffrey Baratheon, first of his name, heir to the Iron Throne and to the considerable patience of his hosts. Aemon looked up at him with perfect pleasantness. I know who you are. Joffrey's face worked through several things. Then you know I could order you to give you a sword that isn't mine to give. Aemon let that sit for a beat. Dawn belongs to House Dayne. It doesn't leave that ownership because someone with a different house's name orders it to. He kept his tone conversational, the way you correct a misunderstanding about the weather. Your father couldn't order me to hand it over. He wouldn't try because he knows that's not how it works. He picked up his cup. Sit down if you like, have some wine. We don't need to argue about this. Your Joffrey stopped. He was 12 and had been told he could have anything, and the architecture of his face showed the specific stress of a person whose foundational belief is being questioned. You're a lord of a minor house, he said, and the minor had poison on it, the cruelty of a child who's been taught that rank is a weapon. I am, Aemon agreed mildly, and you're a guest in a house that isn't yours, speaking to one of your host's most honored lords. He glanced at the surrounding seats, where a very attentive audience of Dornish lords and ladies had arranged their faces into elaborate expressions of neutrality, which means the manor's argument cuts both ways. From somewhere near the center of the table, audible even through the noise, came the sound of Oberyn Martell laughing. Joffrey stood there for a moment, caught between the escalation he wanted and the instinct, still undeveloped but present, that told him the escalation wasn't going to go well. He looked at Dawn one more time with that naked, wanting expression, and then he turned and walked back to his seat with the stiff precision of someone choosing a retreat they're pretending isn't a retreat. The 2 trailing boys went with him. Aemon set down his cup and found Tywin Lannister looking at him from his seat further up the table, not obviously, not in a way that the room could read, but directly. The old lion's face was utterly still, and his eyes were the color of old gold, and they were calculating something with the cold, detached efficiency of a mind that had been doing nothing but calculate for 50 years. Then Tywin Lannister looked away. Aemon felt the back of his neck go slightly cold, the way it did when something in a situation shifted from interesting to genuinely serious. That night late, when the feast had broken and the castle had settled into the quiet of a late hour, Aemon couldn't sleep. He dressed and took Dawn and walked out onto the rampart walkway that ran along the south wall of the Tower of the Sun. The night was warm. Dornish nights never got as cold as the rest of Westeros, even at their coolest, and the stars were the same improbable density they always were here, the sky doing its excessive Dornish thing of being too beautiful to take seriously. He was standing at the wall looking south toward the water when he heard footsteps. Not Ashara, her step was lighter. Not Sir Edric, his right hip announced him, not Sira. Oberyn Martell appeared out of the shadows of the walkway with a bottle and 2 cups and the expression of a man who has been waiting for an excuse. Saw the light from your room, he said, which may or may not have been true. He poured wine without asking, set a cup on the parapet ledge beside Aemon's hand, and stood beside him looking south. They stood in silence for a moment, which was comfortable in a way that Aemon hadn't expected. Oberyn was not a man built for comfortable silence, but he seemed capable of it when the situation called for it. "You're very good at that," Oberyn said finally. "At what? Handling situations like tonight." "Joffrey," he drank, "you don't get angry." "I do," Aemon said. "I just don't find it useful. Most 16-year-olds find it very useful." Oberyn said it without judgment, a simple observation. "What I mean is, where did that come from? The composure. Your mother has it, but hers is different. Hers was learned, earned." He glanced at Aemon. "Yours looks like you were born with it." Aemon thought about how to answer that honestly. "I've always known I was different from the people around me," he said. "Not better, just different. When I was young I couldn't have named it. But you learn when you're different from people, that reacting the way they expect you to react puts you on their ground." He looked at the stars. "My mother taught me that a calm person in a room full of angry people controls the room." "She's right." Oberyn was quiet for a moment. "Rhaegar was like that," he said conversationally, casually. "The way you drop a stone into water to watch what happens." Aemon's hands were very still on the parapet. "I met him twice," Oberyn continued, same tone, looking at the southern horizon. "At court years ago, before everything went wrong. He was a serious man, not cold but serious, in the way of people who carry something heavy and have decided the only way to manage it is to not put it down." He drank. "He played the harp beautifully, prophesied things that no one believed until they were already happening." He turned to look at Aemon directly. "He had that same quality you have." Like the world around him was a room he'd already mapped. "What are you doing?" Aemon said, quiet and precise. "I'm telling you about a man I knew," Oberyn said, "because I think you should know he was worth knowing." He met Aemon's eyes. "That's all, not an accusation, not a demand." He set down his cup and looked out at the dark. "There are things your mother will tell you when she decides the moment is right, and those things are hers to tell, not mine." A pause. "But the things I knew about the man, the prince, those are mine to tell." Aemon looked at him for a long moment, then he said, "Tell me," and Oberyn talked. He talked about Rhaegar Targaryen, the way you talk about someone you'd respected without fully understanding, in pieces, in impressions, in the small specific details that stick in memory because they felt true. That he'd been genuinely curious about people, interested in their minds rather than their uses. That he'd had a quality of attention that made the person he was looking at feel like the most important thing in the room. That he'd believed something was coming, a great reckoning, a war against something older than kingdoms, and had been trying to position himself to face it in a way that his father, who was brilliant and burning and falling, could not. That he had made mistakes. Large ones, ones that had cost people everything, that he had known it. Aemon listened without interrupting. The stars wheeled slowly and the southern sea moved in darkness below the castle walls, and Oberyn talked until the wine was finished and the night was deep, and when he finally stopped they stood in silence for a moment. "You're nothing like him," Oberyn said at last, "and you are entirely like him, both at once." He straightened, picked up the empty bottle. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow I want to show you something." "What?" "The Martell Armory." He paused, and the grin came, the fully committed Oberyn Martell grin, which was one of the more genuinely dangerous things Aemon had encountered this week. "And I want to talk to you about Tywin Lannister." "What about him?" "He's been asking questions." Oberyn's voice had a different quality now, quieter, pointed. "Not of Dorne, of his own sources, about Ashara, about you, about the timing of certain events 16 years ago. He watched Aemon's face. "He's an old man with an excellent memory and a very large network, and he does nothing by accident." He turned to go. "Sleep, Aemon. And think about who else in that hall tonight you'd want at your back if the ground shifted." He walked away into the dark of the walkway and left Aemon alone on the rampart. Aemon stood there for a long time after. Below, the castle was quiet, guards moving their rotations, a distant conversation, a horse in the stables making a complaint about something. Normal night sounds, the sounds of a world that hadn't yet decided it was at war. He put his hand on Dawn's hilt, not drawing it, just feeling the steadiness of it, the weight, the sense of something ancient and sure under his palm. Tywin Lannister is asking questions. The shape of what was coming moved closer. He could feel it now, not a suspicion anymore, not an instinct, but something with real weight, the way you feel the ground change under your feet before you see the drop. He thought about what Oberyn had said. Who else in that hall would you want at your back if the ground shifted? Doran Martell maybe in the long game, but Doran's timelines were geological and Aemon didn't know if he had that kind of time. Oberyn, yes, unquestionably yes. Oberyn Martell was one of the most dangerous men alive and had just spent 2 hours telling Aemon things that positioned him, clearly and deliberately, as someone Aemon should trust. His mother, always. He thought about the Lannister end of the table. Cersei watching him, Tywin watching him, Joffrey wanting the sword. He thought about Ned Stark, who was somewhere in the north and who had hidden something for 16 years and was apparently still hiding it, and whom Aemon had never met, and who was, by any reasonable calculation, the only other person alive who knew the full truth of the Tower of Joy. He pushed away from the wall and went inside. The corridor was cool and dark and quiet, and Aemon walked through it with his hand easy at his side, and his mind running and his heart, despite everything, steadier than it had any right to be. He was 16 years old, and a secret that could reshape the world was wrapped around him like a second skin. He went to sleep. Chapter 3. The Sword of the Mornings Shadow. The tournament was Oberyn's idea, which meant it was inevitable. He proposed it over breakfast on the third morning of the king's visit, in the casual tone of a man suggesting they take a different route through the market, and by midday it had somehow become official, a 3-day event announced by Doran's herald, with prize money and a formal list and the full machinery of Dornish hospitality rolling into motion around it. Robert had been delighted. Always was at tournaments. They reminded him of when he'd been young and the world had been something he could hit. The list opened that afternoon. Aemon added his name to it while the ink was still wet on the parchment. The steward running the list looked at his name, looked at the sword on his back, looked at his name again. "My Lord Dayne," he said carefully, "you understand this is an open list. The king's sworn swords will be competing, knights twice your age." "I understand," Aemon said pleasantly. The steward wrote his name down. Ashara found out at dinner. She didn't say anything immediately, which was the specific quality of her disapproval that Aemon found most instructive, the pause, the careful stillness, the processing of information before response. She waited until the other lords at their section of the table were deep in their own conversations, and then she said very quietly, "You entered the tournament." "Yes, with Dawn. It goes where I go. Aemon, not Sharp." Just deliberate, the way she used his name when she wanted him to understand she meant the whole of him, not just the part that was currently making decisions she hadn't sanctioned. "Do you understand what happens when people see you fight with that blade?" "They see a Dane fighting with the Dane sword," he said, equally quiet. "Which is what it is. They see Arthur," she said. "They see the way you move and they think of Arthur, and then they start asking questions about why you move like that and what that means, and—" "I know," he said. "Oberyn already told me what people will think." She looked at him sharply. "Oberyn suggested this, didn't he?" It wasn't quite a question. Aemon met her eyes. "He mentioned there might be a tournament." Ashara sat back and looked at the ceiling briefly in the manner of a woman asking the gods why they had given her this particular child. Then she looked at him. "He's moving things forward." "Is he wrong to?" The question landed between them and sat there. Ashara looked at her plate, then at the table, then at Aemon, and in her face he could see the calculation working, not whether to be angry, but whether the anger would accomplish anything useful. "No," she said finally, and it cost her something to say it. "He's probably not wrong." She picked up her wine. "But I want to be the one who tells you, before you compete, before any of this goes further." "All right, tonight," she said. After dinner, Aemon nodded once, and they finished the meal in a silence that was full to the edges. She came to his room when the castle had gone quiet. She sat in the chair by the window, and he sat on the bed, and she looked at him for a long moment with the expression he now recognized as the one she used when she was deciding how to begin something she had been preparing to say for 16 years. Then she told him, all of it. She started with Rhaegar, not the monster of Robert's retellings, not the romantic hero of Dornish wishful thinking, but the actual man. The prince who had believed in a prophecy old enough to predate the current dynasty. Who had believed the dragon had to have 3 heads and that he needed a 3rd child, and had made choices around that belief that had fractured the world. She described Lyanna Stark not as a victim and not as a prize, but as a woman who had made her own choices, fierce and northern and fully alive. She described the Tower of Joy and what it had held, and why Arthur and 2 other Kingsguard had died on that road to keep it secret. And she told him about the night she had held Lyanna's hand while Lyanna died, and about the child she had lifted from those sheets, and about Ned Stark's face when he arrived too late, an hour, perhaps less, and found Lyanna gone and the baby already bundled in Ashara's arms. "He looked at me," she said, "and I looked at him, and we both understood what was in the other's mind." She was very still in the chair. "Promised Lyanna to protect the boy, keep him from Robert. He was going to take him north and call him a bastard, his bastard from the war, and hide him in the open the way you hide things in the open. But you took me instead," Aemon said. "I had just lost my brother," she said simply, "and my own child, born too soon, didn't survive the day." Something crossed her face that she let him see, which meant she wanted him to understand it. And there was this boy, Rhaegar's boy, Lyanna's boy. Alive and screaming and absolutely furious about it, the ghost of a smile. "You were always furious about things that weren't right. What did Ned say?" he argued quietly. He said the north was safer, that in Dorne the child would be too visible, that someone would put it together. She met Aemon's eyes. I told him that a bastard in the north draws exactly the kind of storytelling that gets people asking questions. A son in Dorne, born of Ashara Dayne, with Dane blood clear in his face and a Dane sword in his future, that's not a story, that's just a boy. She paused, and I told him that I had just lost my brother and my child, and I was not losing this one. Aemon sat with everything she'd given him. He turned it in his mind the way he turned Dawn in his hand, testing the weight, finding the balance. He had known. He had known the outline of it for long enough that the specific facts were less a revelation than a confirmation. But knowing you know something and having it said aloud were different experiences, and he gave himself the space to feel the difference. Rhaegar Targaryen, his father, a man who had died on a river before Aemon was born, killed by a man who was currently sleeping 2 floors above him. Lyanna Stark, his mother, dead, gone before she'd ever held him. Ashara Dayne, his mother, here, real. The woman who had shaped everything he was and chosen him before she'd even known who he'd become. He's north, Aemon said. Ned Stark, he has a ward, yes. Ashara's voice was careful. He calls him Jon Snow, a bastard he claims from the war. Aemon went very still. He kept one too. Ned Stark loved Lyanna, Ashara said. He wasn't going to let her son entirely disappear. She looked at her hands. There are 2 of you, Aemon, which is both a comfort and a danger. Why danger? Because a secret kept by one person is a secret. A secret kept by 2 becomes a story that other people can eventually assemble. She looked up. Robert Baratheon is many things, but he's not stupid, and the people around him are very sharp. Tywin Lannister has been asking. I know about Tywin, Aemon said. Oberyn told me. She absorbed that. How much did Oberyn tell you? Enough to know I needed to hear the rest from you. He looked at her directly. Are you all right? The question surprised her. He could see it. She'd come in here braced to manage his reaction, to answer his questions and absorb his anger and hold the conversation together, and he turned it sideways on her. I will be, she said after a moment. Good. He stood, which ended the sitting down portion of this in the way of his nature because he processed things better in motion. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark castle and the stars beyond it. The tournament is tomorrow. Yes, I'm going to win it. Ashara was quiet for a moment. Then, I know. And people are going to see me fight. Yes, and it's going to start something. He turned from the window. Isn't it? You knew that when you let me add my name to the list. She met his eyes. I told you to bring Dawn to the feast, she said. I told you to let them see all of you. She stood, smoothed her robes with the habitual gesture. I've been keeping you safe for 16 years. I'm very good at it, and it has cost me a great deal, and I don't regret a moment of it. She crossed to him and put her hand against his jaw, the way she had when he was small, except now she had to reach up to do it. But safe and hidden are not the same thing. They never were. She kissed his forehead and left him standing at the window. He looked out at the stars for a long time. Then he unsheathed Dawn and held it in the dark of the room, and the pale blade caught even the faint light of stars and gave it back transformed, white and absolute and quiet. He held that blade like it was an extension of his arm, Oberyn had said, like it chose him. Aemon stood in the dark and felt the truth of that and added the new weight to it, not the weight of a weapon, but the weight of a name he had never been given, and the weight of a man he had never known, and the weight of a prophecy old enough that it had outlasted everyone who'd first heard it. None of it made him afraid. He sheathed the blade and went to sleep. The tournament grounds had been set up outside the main walls in the open ground between Sunspear and the Shadow City, which was the only flat space large enough, and by the time the morning horn sounded to open the event, they were surrounded by spectators 3 rows deep on the makeshift stands and spilling out along the rope lines. Dorne loved a tournament the way it loved everything, loudly and with opinion. Aemon arrived at the competitors' staging area and found it populated by 18 knights and lordlings ranging in age from approximately his own to a gray-haired knight from the Boneway who looked like he'd been competing since tournaments were invented. He knew some of them by sight. He knew one by reputation more specifically, Sir Demon Sand, who was Oberyn's bastard and who was technically not a knight but fought like he was several knights stacked together. Oberyn had apparently entered him as a way of making the competition interesting. Sir Demon was roughly 20, lean and loose-limbed, and he looked at Aemon with the assessing gaze of someone who had been briefed. Oberyn's son had been briefed, of course he had. Heard you were entering, Demon said, not unfriendly, just taking inventory. Heard you were too, my father's idea. Same. Aemon looked across the staging area toward the list. Is he betting on us, on both of us, which means he either expects us to meet in the final or he's covering his exposure. Demon smiled, and he had his father's smile, that sharpened-edge quality, probably both. The morning's first round was on foot, blunted weapons, no armor restriction, first touch scoring on the torso. Aemon was in the third match of the morning, against a compact Dornish knight named Sir Aldrich Jordan, who fought with two short blades and the footwork of a man who had spent a great deal of time in small spaces. The crowd that gathered to watch when Aemon drew dawn, even the blunted tourney version, the practice-weighted replica that went everywhere the real sword went, had a specific quality of collective breath-holding. He felt it. The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. The ripple through the stands, the turned heads, the elbowing and the pointing and the murmur that moved through the crowd in a wave from the point where he stood. He ignored it and watched Sir Aldrich. Sir Aldrich was watching the crowd's reaction to dawn with a calculation that Aemon respected. The man was adapting in real time, deciding whether the legendary blade changed his tactical approach. He decided it didn't, which was the right answer. The blade was irrelevant to the fight. The person holding it was what mattered. The horn sounded. Sir Aldrich came in fast, which was the correct response to facing a longer weapon, collapse the distance, make the reach advantage work against the wielder. Aemon let him come the first 3 steps, read the angle of the first blade, and sidestepped so completely that Sir Aldrich had to change direction mid-strike, which cost him his second blade's timing. And by the time he'd recovered, Aemon had already placed a clean touch on his left ribs with a motion that made it look effortless because by now it was. The crowd made the sound crowds made it something they hadn't expected to see. Not a cheer, not yet, just a collective exhale. The next 2 exchanges lasted longer. Sir Aldrich was good, properly good, not making the mistake twice, and Aemon had to work for it, reading the double blade rhythm and finding the gaps between his patterns, a problem that was genuinely interesting to solve. He got touched once on the shoulder, which the crowd responded to with another sound that was part surprise and part approval that this wasn't completely one-sided. He won the match with 3 touches to 1, and as he stepped back from the line, he heard someone in the stands begin a slow clap that others picked up with the particular enthusiasm of Dornish spectators who'd been given something to be enthusiastic about. He drank some water, ignored the noise, and watched the next match. From the royal pavilion, which had been erected on a low platform at the tournament's east end with the best sightline and a great deal of Martell orange mixed carefully with Baratheon black, Robert Baratheon was watching with the engaged concentration of a man who understood fighting and appreciated the sight of it done well. Beside him, Cersei sat in the careful posture of someone who cared about appearances and nothing else regarding the tournament, which was not quite true. Aemon had caught her eyes twice during his first match, and they were too focused for indifference. Tywin was further back in the pavilion in the shadow, which was where Tywin preferred to be, watching, and Ned Stark was in the stands. Aemon hadn't known Ned was coming. The information hadn't been in any of the briefings Ashara had given him or in any of Oberyn's careful navigations of the political landscape. But there he was, a northern lord among southern ones, gray-eyed and dark of hair, and carrying himself with the contained quality of a man who is always slightly uncomfortable in rooms where people perform rather than act. He was flanked by what appeared to be a small northern retinue, and he was watching the tournament list with the attentiveness of a man who had been watching it since Aemon's first match. Aemon saw him from across the yard in the gap between his second and third rounds, and something moved through him that was harder to name than the straightforward emotions, not quite recognition, not quite accusation, but something that had the quality of both. This man had held Lyanna Stark's hand at the Tower of Joy and let her die. No, wrong framing. This man had held his sister at the end of what couldn't be undone, and then he'd stood over a newborn child and made a decision about its life, and then another woman had made a different decision, and the two of them had been carrying the weight of those decisions for 16 years. Aemon looked at him across the tournament ground. Ned Stark's eyes found him as if they'd been looking for exactly that face. The contact lasted 4 or 5 seconds. Then a body moved between them, and Aemon turned to his next opponent, and the moment closed. He was in the final by mid-afternoon. He'd beaten 4 knights in succession, Sir Aldrich in the opening round, then a Tolan knight who was technically accomplished but predictable, then one of the king's sworn swords who was genuinely dangerous and took Aemon 3 proper exchanges before the pattern opened up, and then Sir Demon Sand in the semi-final in a match that the crowd absolutely lost its collective mind about. Demon was excellent. He was the best technical fighter Aemon had faced in the tournament, and the match lasted 20 minutes of proper back and forth that had the crowd on their feet for long stretches. And when Aemon finally won it, by a single touch, the last one an improvised angle he'd never used before that Demon simply hadn't seen coming because Aemon had invented it in the moment, there was a beat of stunned silence before the roar hit. He was breathing harder than he'd admitted to anyone as he crossed to the water station. Demon fell into step beside him, not defeated-looking. Oberyn's son was too good for that, but with the considering expression of a man deciding how to file what he'd just experienced. "Where did that last move come from?" he asked. "I don't know," Aemon said honestly. Demon looked at him. "You didn't plan it. I planned the opening. The rest happens." He drank water and looked across the yard to where the other finalist was preparing, the gray-haired Boneway knight, Sir Cletus Ironwood, who had beaten everyone else with the patient authority of a man who had been doing this for 30 years and didn't need to hurry. "What do you know about Ironwood's guard?" "High left shoulder," Demon said immediately. "When he transitions from attack to defense, it comes up too far. It's been working because no one's been fast enough to use it before he corrects." He paused. "But that won't be an issue for you." Aemon drank more water and thought about Sir Cletus Ironwood and the high left shoulder and the specific geometry of Dawn's reach. "Go watch your father lose his bet," he said. Demon laughed, which was a good sound, and walked away. The final round was not the longest match of the day, which surprised people who expected a climax to stretch. It lasted 7 minutes. 7 minutes of Aemon Dayne and Sir Cletus Ironwood, who was strong and patient and had 3 decades of hard fighting in his body and knew exactly how to use all of it, moving around each other in the raked sand of the list, while the crowd around them went between silence and noise in the specific rhythm of people watching something they weren't sure they understood. Ironwood was good in the way that mattered most. He didn't make mistakes. He didn't overcommit, and he didn't underestimate, and he fought the actual fight rather than the fight he'd expected, which made him a genuinely difficult problem. In the first 2 minutes he touched Aemon twice, clean, controlled touches that said, "I see what you're doing and I can stop it," and the crowd responded to that with appreciation for the veteran and with something like visible anxiety for the boy, because they'd watched Aemon all day and they'd decided somewhere around the 3rd round that they wanted him to win. Aemon reset after the 2nd touch and changed everything. He didn't change his weapon. He changed the pace, the internal tempo he was running at, which until now had been matching Ironwood's rhythms, engaging on the older knight's terms. He stopped doing that. He took 3 steps back, which looked like retreat and wasn't, and let Ironwood commit to an advance, and then he moved faster than he had all day, not with any single dramatic technique, but with a sustained, relentless, multi-directional pressure that forced Ironwood to defend continuously without the space to counter. And somewhere in that sustained pressure, the high left shoulder came up on a transition, and Aemon put 3 touches on the torso in 5 seconds with the efficient certainty of a man who'd been waiting for exactly this since Demon told him about it. The silence after the final horn was about 1 full breath long. Then the Dornish crowd became entirely itself. He could feel it more than hear it. The sound had that physical quality, like weather. He stood in the middle of the list with the tourney Dawn in his hand and his chest rising and falling and the noise wrapping around him, and he found himself looking at the royal pavilion before he decided to. Robert Baratheon was on his feet, which was something. Kings generally didn't stand for tournament finalists who weren't royal. He was applauding with the straightforward appreciation of a man who respects fighting regardless of the fighter, and there was nothing complicated about it. Robert, in this moment, was just a man who loved a good fight and had just seen one. Beside him, Cersei's hands were clasped in her lap and her face was arranged into a smile that touched everything it was supposed to touch. Her eyes were on Aemon with a calculation that hadn't changed since the first feast. Tywin was standing. He was not applauding. He was looking at Aemon the way a man looks at a document he's trying to verify, checking it against something internal, something he already knew. And at the far edge of the royal pavilion, separated from the Lannisters by 6 other lords, stood Ned Stark. He wasn't applauding. He wasn't smiling. He was looking at Aemon with an expression that had too many things in it to name quickly: grief and recognition, and something that was almost guilt and something older than guilt. He was looking at Aemon the way a man looks at a ghost he'd been carrying for 16 years and had just met in person. Aemon held his gaze. He held it for long enough that several people near Ned Stark noticed the direction of Ned's attention and turned to see what he was looking at, and Aemon, who was aware of being watched by a great many people already, did not look away from the Northern Lord's face. Then he turned, gave the formal acknowledge the pavilion bow that tournament custom required, and walked off the list. Ned Stark found him 20 minutes later. Not immediately, he came after the formal congratulations, after Doran's herald had presented the prize, and after Oberyn had appeared out of nowhere to slap Aemon on the back with genuine warmth and say something in his ear that made several nearby people laugh, and after Sir Edric had said everything he had to say about footwork and follow-through and said it twice for emphasis. After all of that, when the crowd was dispersing and the list was clearing, a northern voice said his name. "My Lord Dayne." He turned. Ned Stark was alone. He'd left his retinue somewhere and come by himself, which was either trust or the understanding that this conversation didn't need witnesses. He was shorter than Aemon had imagined, not a small man, but a compact one, built for endurance rather than spectacle, with a graying beard and those stark gray eyes that were steady and serious and currently doing something complicated in the region of his composure. "Lord Stark," Aemon said. They looked at each other. "You fight like your uncle," Ned said. His voice was quiet, controlled in the way of a man who has decided what he's going to say and is delivering it one careful word at a time. "Arthur Dayne, you have his," he stopped, swallowed. "You have his footwork, his transitions." "So I've been told," Aemon said. Ned was looking at him with that complicated expression, grief and recognition still, and underneath them something that was working very hard at being just a Lord of the North meeting a Lord of the South and having a normal conversation about a tournament. It was not succeeding. "You were born the year the war ended," Ned said. "I was, at Starfall." It wasn't quite a question. Aemon looked at him directly and said, "That's what I was told." Something shifted in Ned's face, a tiny admission of the weight he was carrying, visible for half a second before he managed it back into composure. "Lady Ashara is here," he said. "With you." "She is. I'd like to speak with her." He said it plainly, with the bluntness of a northern lord rather than the careful indirection of a southern one. "If she's willing." "That's between you and her," Aemon said, "but I imagine she expected it when she heard you were here." Ned nodded once slowly, the way you nod when something you already knew is confirmed. He started to turn and then stopped because there was something else. Aemon could see it in the line of his shoulders, the thing he hadn't managed to say yet. He would have. Ned stopped again. His jaw worked, for what it's worth. He looked at Aemon again with the full weight of those gray eyes. "She would have wanted you to know that he spoke of the future with." The sentence broke apart on something real, on 16 years of a promise held so tightly it had changed the shape of the person keeping it. "Lord Stark," Aemon said, and his voice was even and not unkind. "I know who I am. I've known long enough to have made my peace with the pieces I don't have." He looked at the Northern Lord steadily. "What I know is who raised me. What I know is what I was made into." He didn't look away. "Whatever you're carrying, whatever you promised, I think you should know that it worked. She kept me safe. She made me into someone worth protecting." Ned Stark looked at him for a long moment, then something moved in his face, not a release exactly, but a small, quiet settling, the way a man looks when a burden he's been carrying is acknowledged by the person for whom he carried it. "She always was stronger than any of us," he said softly. "Ashara." He said her name with the particular care of a man who had been careful with that name for 16 years. "Send her my regards. Tell her," he paused, "tell her Lyanna would have been proud." He turned and walked back through the dispersing crowd. Aemon watched him go. He stood in the empty yard with the noise of the celebration moving away around him and the afternoon sun hitting the pale replica sword in his hand, and turned everything over one more time. Lyanna would have been proud. He didn't know the woman. He'd never know the woman. She was a story he'd been given in pieces, fierce, northern, alive in the way of things that burn hot and short. She had chosen Rhaegar and paid for it and died before the consequence of that choice had drawn its first breath. He looked up at the sky, that excessive Dornish sky, blue and deep and unconcerned with the things happening beneath it. He felt, for the first time, the full complicated weight of what he was. Not a secret, not a weapon, not a prophecy. A person, with a dead mother in the north and a dead father on a river and a living mother in a Dornish castle who had chosen all of this on a single night. He breathed it in and breathed it out. Then he sheathed Dawn and went to find Ashara because she needed to know Ned Stark was here, and because whatever happened next would happen faster than either of them had planned, and because the ground was already shifting under all of them whether they were ready or not. Behind him, he didn't see Tywin Lannister watching from the shadow of the competitor's gate with the expression of a man who has just confirmed something he suspected. Or perhaps he did see it. Perhaps he catalogued it with the efficient, forward-facing attention that was his natural state, the peripheral awareness of a person who has been taught that what stands at the edge of your vision is often more dangerous than what stands in front of you. He filed it. He kept walking. He was 17 years old and the world had just changed shape around him, and he was the only person in it who was not surprised. Chapter 4, The Edge of the World. The conversation between Ashara and Ned Stark lasted 2 hours. Aemon wasn't in the room for it. He hadn't been invited and he hadn't pushed. It was their conversation. Their 16 years of held breath finally releasing, and whatever they said to each other in the small receiving chamber off the Martell guest wing was theirs to say without him standing in the middle of it. He sat in the corridor outside and sharpened Dawn with a whetstone and listened to the sound of the castle around him and waited. Sira sat beside him with her legs crossed and a book she wasn't reading. "You're very calm about this," she said after a while. "Would being upset change what they're saying in there? Then calm is the right choice." She looked at him sideways. "You found out last night that the king sleeping 2 floors above us is the man who killed your father and would kill you if he knew you existed, and you're sharpening your sword." "Dawn doesn't sharpen," he said. "The edge holds itself. I'm doing this because it gives my hands something to do." Sira was quiet for a moment. "Are you afraid of him, Robert?" Aemon ran the stone along the blade in the careful motion Sir Edric had shown him, not because it was necessary, but because the motion was meditative. "No," he said, "you should be at least a little afraid of him." "Being afraid of him means thinking about him as a threat to me personally," Aemon said. "Right now he's not. Right now he's a man who doesn't know I exist, which means he's not a danger, which means the fear would be anticipatory." He glanced at her. "Anticipatory fear is just anxiety wearing a practical coat. It doesn't help. Your mother taught you that, Oberyn, actually." Sira thought about this. "I'm going to be afraid for you," she said. "Someone in this situation should be." He smiled at that, genuinely. "Fair enough." The door opened at the end of the second hour, and Ashara came out with the carefully arranged composure of a woman who had been crying recently and had decided to be done with it. Her eyes were clear, but there was a quality around them that was new, not grief exactly, but the aftermath of something that had taken effort. Behind her, Ned Stark came out with the same contained quality he seemed to carry everywhere, except his jaw was slightly set in a way that suggested the conversation had not been entirely comfortable for either of them. He nodded at Aemon. Not the complicated, grief-weighted look from the tournament ground. This one was simpler. An acknowledgement. A man who has said what he needed to say to the people he needed to say it to. Then he walked away down the corridor, and Ashara lowered herself into the chair across from Aemon and sat without speaking for a long moment. "Well," Aemon said. "He's going back north," she said. "He wants you to come." She raised a hand immediately, stopping the response forming on his face. "Not to stay, not to claim anything. He wants you to understand the other half of what you are." She held his eyes. "He said the wall is important. That there are things happening in the north that make everything happening here look like a children's game." She paused. He used those words exactly. Aemon thought about the wall. He'd known about it the way everyone knew about it, the great structure at the top of the world, manned by the Night's Watch, keeping the wilderness out. He'd known about it as geography and as history. He'd never thought about it as relevant. "What things?" he said. He didn't say specifically. He said there are reports that the Watch has been sending ravens south for years, and the ravens get filed and ignored, and the things in the reports are becoming harder to ignore. She looked at him steadily. "He said if you go north, just to the wall, just to see, you'll understand why he thinks it matters more than any of this." "He thinks I should care about the north," Aemon said slowly, "over everything that's happening here. He thinks you should understand everything before you decide what to care about." Ashara smoothed her robe. "I think he's right. I think you need to go." Aemon looked at his mother. In 16 years she had never pushed him toward anything she wasn't certain about. Her caution was a precision instrument. She only deployed it for things that mattered. "You want me out of Sunspear," he said. "While Tywin is asking questions," she met his eyes. "I want you moving," she said. "Yes, a moving target is harder to pin." She was quiet for a moment. "And I think Ned is right about the north. I think there's something in that direction that matters to what you are." She said it plainly, not mysteriously, the way she said most things when she decided to say them. The prophecy that Rhaegar believed, the one that shaped every choice he made, it was about a war, not a political war, an old war. Against what? Something that doesn't care about thrones, she said. He thought about that. He thought about Rhaegar positioning himself against something that hadn't yet arrived, making choices that fractured the entire world, not from madness, not from simple ambition, but from a belief that there was a larger threat than any of the ones visible at court. "All right," he said. "I'll come back to Starfall," Ashara said. "I'll manage what needs managing here. Dorne needs to know what's happening, and Oberyn needs a conversation he's been waiting for. And you," she stood, and for a moment she just looked at him. "You take 20 riders and go north, and you see what Ned Stark wants you to see, and you come back knowing everything instead of knowing almost everything. And if Tywin moves while I'm gone, Tywin Lannister does not move quickly," she said. "He moves once and completely when he's ready. He's not ready yet, he's still in the information phase." The certainty in her voice was the certainty of a woman who had been watching powerful men for 20 years. "We have time, not much, but enough." She kissed his forehead and went inside. Aemon sat in the corridor with Dawn across his knees and thought about the wall. He told Oberyn that night. The prince took it with the equanimity of a man who had expected something like this, which meant he probably had expected exactly this, which meant he and Ned Stark had spoken separately, and Aemon was being steered by two people who were better at stealth than he'd given either of them credit for. He said as much. Oberyn laughed. You're not being steered, he said. You're being aimed. What's the difference? Steering is someone else controlling your direction. Aiming is someone pointing at what's real and letting you decide for yourself. He was sharpening his actual spear, not a tourney replica but the real one, thin and flexible, with the martel crest on the butt and a point that had killed men with it. The North matters. Ned Stark doesn't overstate things. If he says the wall is something you need to understand, then it is. You believe in the old stories, Aemon said. It wasn't a question. I believe in things that don't care whether you believe in them, Oberyn said, which is a different position. The White Walkers, the long night, the age-old thing beyond the wall, I don't know if those stories are true. I know that they were true once 8,000 years ago, and that things which were true once have a habit of becoming true again. He tested the spear point with his thumb. Rhaegar believed. He believed it so completely that he burned his entire life down to position himself and his children against it. He looked at Aemon. That is either the act of a madman or the act of someone who saw something the rest of us couldn't. Or both, Aemon said. Or both, Oberyn agreed, which is perhaps the most honest answer. They were quiet for a moment. Tyene is going to be angry you're leaving, Oberyn said. She'll live. She's been following you around for 3 days. I noticed. Oberyn set down the spear and looked at him with a complicated fondness that Aemon had come to recognize as the specific quality of Oberyn's affection for people he had decided mattered. Come back, he said simply. Come back quickly and come back knowing what you are, because things here are going to move while you're gone and I need you present and whole when they do. What things? Tywin had a private meeting with Dorne this afternoon, Oberyn said. 4 hours. I wasn't invited. His jaw had a quality in it that Aemon had not seen before, a tightness, something held down with effort. Whatever he proposed, Dorne is thinking about it, which means it's either very good or very expensive, or both. He picked up his spear. When you come back, we'll know what it is, and then we'll decide what to do about it. Aemon nodded. And Aemon, Oberyn met his eyes. The North is going to do something to you. I don't know exactly what, but I know this. Men who go to the wall come back different. They come back understanding something about scale that you can't get from politics or tourneys, or even from standing in a room with a king. He paused. Don't fight it. Whatever you feel up there, don't manage it. Let it be real. They left 2 days after the tournament. 20 riders from the Starfall garrison plus Sira, who had stated her intention to come with the flat certainty of someone who had already packed and was not interested in objections. Aemon hadn't objected. He'd long since learned that Sira's presence in difficult situations was an asset rather than a concern. Ned Stark rode with them as far as King's Landing, which he was obligated to pass through on his return north, and the journey north from Sunspear was strange in the way that journeys are strange when the people making them are full of things they're not quite ready to say. They talked about practical things, road conditions, weather, the political texture of the cities they passed through. Ned was not a man who spoke freely or with ease, but he was honest, and when he did say something it landed with the weight of being fully meant. On the 3rd day, somewhere in the reach with the road empty and the riders spread out and no one close enough to hear, Ned said, "She was extraordinary." He didn't say who. He didn't need to. Aemon looked at the road ahead. "Tell me something specific," he said. "Not," he found the words, "not what she was like in general, something specific that you remember." Ned was quiet for long enough that Aemon thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "She used to whistle when she was thinking, just under her breath, tuneless, drove everyone mad." A pause. "She beat me at swords the first time she picked one up. I was 9, she was 7. She said that wasn't fair, and then she beat me again to prove it wasn't luck." Aemon looked at him. Ned was looking at the road with the gray-eyed steadiness of a man presenting a fact. "She sounds impossible," Aemon said. "She was," Ned said. "Entirely," the road continued. Neither of them said anything else about it, and they didn't need to. He parted with Ned Stark at King's Landing's northern gate and turned his column east and then north, following the King's Road into the country that got bigger and colder and quieter the further it went. The reach gave way to the riverlands, which gave way to the neck, which gave way to the north, and the north was a different country, a different feeling, something in the air and the stone and the light that was unlike anything he'd grown up in. He'd been born here, technically, or near enough to hear. He carried northern blood in his body and had never once felt it until now, as the road climbed and the trees became pines and the sky became lower and grayer and enormous. Sira rode beside him with her cloak pulled tighter than she'd been pulling it every day for the last week and said, "This is not a place built for human comfort." "No," he agreed. "The Dornish have it right. You should live somewhere that wants you alive." "I like it," he said. He wasn't entirely sure why. There was something in the scale of it, the sheer undecorated vastness of the northern landscape that was doing something to him he hadn't anticipated. Not comfort exactly, more like recognition. The way you sometimes step into a room you've never been in and understand its layout without thinking about it. "Of course you like it," Sira said darkly. You like things that are trying to kill you. She wasn't wrong about the cold. It came down through the pine trees with a conviction that was unlike the desert cold of Dorne's nights. This was a cold with ambitions, patient and total. He wore a northern cloak he'd acquired in the Riverlands, and it helped, but only in the way that a door helps with a siege. Castle Black appeared after a day's ride along the base of the wall, and the wall itself, he had heard about the wall. He had read descriptions and heard stories and seen drawings in the Starfall library that attempted to convey its dimensions. None of it was adequate. It was 700 feet of ice and ancient magic rising straight out of the frozen earth, and it ran east and west until it disappeared over the horizon in both directions. And standing at its base was a physical experience rather than a visual one. The cold coming off it was its own weather, and the scale of it pressed down on something in the mind that tried to process large things and simply stopped, because there were no categories for this. He stood at the base of it with his neck craned and said nothing for a full minute. Bigger than described, Sira said quietly beside him, her earlier complaints entirely suspended by the reality of what she was looking at. Yes, he said. He put his hand against the ice. It was shockingly cold, not just cold to the touch, but cold, deep cold, the cold of something that had been frozen for 8,000 years and was not interested in changing. And there was something else in it that he couldn't name, something that moved through his palm and up his arm like a frequency too low to hear but not too low to feel. He pulled his hand back and looked at it. Are you all right? Sira asked. Yes, he said, which was true, and also he wasn't sure yet, which was also true. The Lord Commander of the Night's Watch was Jeor Mormont, called the Old Bear, and he received Aemon in Castle Black's great hall with the wariness of a man who had been visited by enough southern lords with southern agendas to be skeptical of the category on sight. He was a large man, gray-bearded, built like the North itself, solid and enduring and weathered to the bone. He had a raven on his shoulder that regarded Aemon with the specific disdain of a bird that has decided humans are beneath it. Lord Dayne, he said, I got Ned Stark's raven ahead of you. He gestured at the bench across from him. Sit. Aemon sat. His escort had been placed in the garrison accommodations, and Sira had been shown to guest quarters with the cautious hospitality of men who didn't see many women. Dawn was on Aemon's back. The old bear looked at it. He was old enough to have known the previous generation, old enough to have seen Arthur Dayne, perhaps. His eyes had that particular recognition in them that Aemon had now seen enough times to file quietly. Ned says you're worth showing the wall to, Mormont said. Then I hope it's a good view. The old bear's mouth moved in the direction of amusement without fully committing. What do you know about what we do here? You guard the realm from what's north of the wall, Aemon said. You've been doing it for 8,000 years. The Watch has been declining for generations, fewer men, less funding, less political support from the south. The southern lords treat the Watch as a penal institution rather than a defensive force. Succinct, Mormont said. Accurate. He reached for his wine. What do you know about why we're here, the actual reason, not the political version? The White Walkers, Aemon said. The others, the Long Night. He held Mormont's gaze. I know the stories. They're not stories, Mormont said, and the way he said it, flat, tired, certain, the way a man speaks when he is sick of being told that the thing he is watching is not real, landed with a weight that made the hall feel colder. We've been sending ravens south for 3 years. Reports of things beyond the wall, wildling villages empty and cold, rangers not coming back, dead things that won't stay dead. He set down his cup. The ravens get filed. The Meisters write polite letters about the severity of the winters. The lords send fewer men. He looked at Aemon. Last month I lost 2 rangers north of the Fist of the First Men, 2 good men not found by wildlings. What found them? Something that was once a man, Mormont said carefully, but isn't any more. The hall was very quiet. When Ned Stark says this matters more than the politics of the South, Aemon said, he means this, he means this. Mormont stood, which was the signal that they were done with the sitting down portion of this conversation. Come, I'll show you the wall from the top. The lift that went to the top of the wall was a cage of ancient wood and rope that ascended 700 feet with the confidence of something that had made this trip 10,000 times and found the repetition humbling. Aemon rode it with Mormont and 2 black brothers and gripped nothing, because gripping the sides acknowledged the height. Sira had declined the lift. At the top the wind hit with a ferocity that explained the wall's entire personality. Up here in the open it wasn't cold the way things at the base were cold. It was cold as a decision, a full-body revision of your understanding of temperature. He pulled the cloak tighter and stood at the edge of the top walkway and looked north. The north beyond the wall was enormous. That was the only word that worked, and it didn't work. Forest, the haunted forest, dark even in the pale afternoon light, running to the horizon in every direction without a break, broken only by occasional clearings of gray and white that might be snow plains or frozen water. No movement visible from here, no sign of anything living, just the vast, indifferent wilderness going north until it ended in something that wasn't visible from this height, but he could feel it. That was the thing he hadn't expected, and the thing that Mormont was watching him for. Aemon could see the old man watching him sideways, gauging his reaction. He could feel something from the north, not threatening, not immediately, but present. The way you feel the weight of something large before you see it, the displacement of air. He stood at the top of the wall and felt the north looking back at him, and something in the blood that had made him responded. He couldn't have explained it. The Targaryen blood, fire, his mother had said, the dynasty of fire, but this was not fire. This was something older than fire, and it knew him, and the knowing was not hostile, but it was absolute. You feel it, Mormont said, not a question. Yes. Not everyone does, the old man said. Most men come up here, they see a forest and feel the cold, and they go back down and tell themselves the stories are old women's tales. He was quiet. Some men feel it, what it is on the other side, the wrong of it. He looked north. Your ancestor, Aemon Targaryen, the Maester at this very castle for 60 years. He felt it too, said the wall was built to answer a need, and the need hadn't gone away. Aemon looked at him sharply. Maester Aemon, your name isn't an accident then, Mormont said with the evenness of a man making an observation rather than a revelation. No, Aemon said, probably not. He stood at the top of the wall for a long time, long enough that his feet went numb, and the two black brothers with them retreated to the windbreak shelter at the lift head. Long enough that the sun moved a perceptible amount, and the light on the northern forest changed from gray to something slightly warmer and then gray again. He looked north and thought about Rhaegar Targaryen believing in a war that hadn't started yet. He thought about the prophecy, the prince that was promised, Azor Ahai reborn, a song of ice and fire. He'd heard the words from Ashara without attaching them to himself, storing them as information rather than instruction. Now standing here he felt them differently, not as a destiny imposed from outside, not as a role he'd been cast in before his birth, as a direction the way dawn pointed when you held it level, simple and clear, north. Something was coming from the north, something that made the games of the south, the thrones and the alliances and the secret identities and the political marriages, look like what they were, people arguing about the furniture arrangement while the house was on fire. He understood Ned Stark's urgency now, not abstractly, in his body. He turned from the north and looked south, the other direction, the warm direction, Dorne and Kings and all of it, and thought about everything he'd left behind and everything he'd come back to. He could hold both, that was the thing, he didn't have to choose. He came down from the wall in the late afternoon and found Castle Black in a state of moderate excitement that had not been present when he went up. The source was immediately obvious. There was a new arrival in the courtyard, standing beside a horse that looked tired from several days of hard riding, arguing cheerfully with a black brother about where his bags should go. He was roughly Aemon's age, dark-haired, gray-eyed in the specific northern way, and carrying himself with the unconscious ease of someone who'd been doing physical things outdoors since before he could walk. He turned at the sound of Aemon's approach. They looked at each other. The recognition was immediate and irrational and completely specific, not of a person they'd met before because they hadn't, but of something in the shape and bearing and quality of presence that was like looking at a mirror that showed a different person but the same thing underneath the person. Aemon stopped walking. The dark-haired boy stopped arguing about his bags. "You're not a black brother," the boy said. His voice was northern, direct, not impolite but undecorated in the way of people who don't see the point of decoration. "No," Aemon said, "I'm a visitor. From the south." The boy looked at Dawn. His eyes moved across the pale blade with frank interest rather than reverence. "Dawn, yes, I've heard of it." He looked back at Aemon's face with the gray-eyed steadiness that Aemon had now seen in Ned Stark and recognized as a northern quality, apparently genetic. "Jon Snow, Lord Stark's," a brief, small hesitation, ward. Aemon looked at him and thought about everything Ashara had told him on the night she'd told him everything. A boy in the north who Ned claimed as a bastard, two of them she had said, which is both a comfort and a danger. "Aemon Dayne," he said. Of Starfall, Jon Snow's eyes went sharp in a way that said he was quicker than his direct manner suggested. "Dayne," he repeated. "Arthur Dayne's nephew, Ashara's son." Jon nodded slowly, still looking at him with that assessing quality. "Lord Stark told me you might be coming," he said. Then without ornament, "Why? To see the wall, that's the official answer." Aemon looked at him for a moment. This boy, this ward of Ned Stark who had the same stillness and the same quality of coiled readiness in those northern gray eyes, was not stupid and was not going to be satisfied with official answers. To understand something about who I am, Aemon said, which was more honest. Jon Snow held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then he nodded once, the same compact nod Ned Stark used when something was confirmed rather than learned. The old man up top, he said. The wall you went up, yes, and it's real, Aemon said. Whatever's on the other side of it, it's real. Jon Snow looked north, a brief automatic glance in that direction that said he'd been doing it his entire life, and something in his face settled into the expression of someone whose own private certainty has just been acknowledged by a reliable source. Come on, he said. Mormont will want to debrief you, and after that we can actually talk. He picked up his bags. Unless you're one of those southerners who can't eat Black Brothers food. I grew up in Dorne, Aemon said, falling into step beside him. I can eat anything. Good, Jon said, because it's terrible. They talked for most of the night, not about what they were to each other. That conversation would come, Aemon knew, but not yet, not on the first night. What they talked about was everything else, and it turned out everything else was considerable. Jon Snow had grown up at Winterfell with the specific Stark education, northern history, swordsmanship, the management of land and people, the weight of obligations. He was a natural fighter in the way Aemon was a natural fighter, except his style was northern rather than Dornish, more direct, less economical, built on power and aggression, where Aemon was built on speed and precision. They talked about technique for an hour with the absorbed pleasure of two people who had found a shared language. Jon had also grown up with the wall as a fact rather than a story. He'd been here before, younger, visiting with Ned. He'd stood at the top and felt what Aemon had felt today, and he hadn't had anyone to tell about it who wouldn't have managed his reaction with careful gentleness. He told Aemon about the Rangers not coming back, and the wildlings moving south in numbers that didn't match the normal patterns, and the quality of wrongness in the reports that came back from beyond the wall, not specific enough to be actionable, just persistent enough to be impossible to ignore. Mormont thinks it's coming, Jon said. Not in 10 years, soon. What does Lord Stark think? Jon's jaw moved slightly. He thinks it's coming, and he thinks no one south of the Neck will believe it until it's already here. He looked at the fire they'd built in the old hall where they'd settled. He's probably right. He is right, Aemon said. I've spent the last 2 weeks in Sunspear watching a king and a spymaster play games over trade routes and marriage alliances, while the Night's Watch loses men to things that won't stay dead. He wasn't bitter about it, he was accurate. The South isn't built to look north, not really. Are you? Jon said. He was looking at Aemon with the direct, undecorated question of someone who genuinely wanted to know. Aemon thought about it honestly, about the blood he carried, northern, southern, Targaryen fire and Stark ice, and about standing at the top of the wall and feeling the North look back. I think that's why I'm here, he said. Jon was quiet for a moment. Then Lord Stark sent you north. Yes, he doesn't do things without reasons. No, Aemon agreed. Jon looked at the fire. There was something he was working toward, something he was deciding whether to say, and Aemon gave him the space to work through it. He's never told me who my mother is, Jon said finally, to the fire rather than to Aemon. I've asked. He says it's not time. He paused. I used to think it was because the answer was shameful somehow, a woman he didn't want to claim. The firelight moved. I don't think that anymore. Aemon said nothing. I think, Jon said slowly, carefully, like a man testing ice, that the reason he doesn't tell me is because the answer would change everything. The fire crackled. Jon, Aemon said quietly. Don't, Jon said, not harshly, just a clear boundary. Not yet, I'm not. He stopped. I've been building up to asking that question my whole life, and I'm not ready to hear the answer from a stranger on the first night. He finally looked at Aemon. Even if the stranger feels like even if it's not, he stopped again. Take your time, Aemon said. Are you actually this patient? Jon asked, with the bluntness of someone changing the subject by force, or is it a Dornish thing? Both, Aemon said. Jon looked at him for a long moment. Then, despite everything, he laughed, a real laugh surprised out of him, and it changed his face entirely, made him younger and less guarded and fully present. Aemon found himself laughing too. They sat in the cold hall of Castle Black with the fire between them and the wall outside in the northern dark beyond the wall, and laughed about nothing for a moment, and then they went back to talking about swords and tactics and the things that were coming, and neither of them said what they both already knew, because some truths needed their own timing and forcing them served no one. Outside, the night was absolute and cold, and the stars above the wall were different from Dornish stars, harder, further away, unconcerned, but present. Aemon sat in the firelight and felt both halves of himself for the first time simultaneously, the warmth and the cold, the south and the north, dawn on his back and the wall outside, and a boy beside him who was, by any reasonable reading of the evidence, the closest thing he had to a brother. He didn't say that either. He let the fire burn and the night be what it was and the wall stand in the dark like it had always stood, waiting for the thing that was eventually going to come against it. Some things didn't need to be said to be true. Chapter 5, The Shape of Fire. He stayed at Castle Black for 6 days. Not because he'd planned 2, he'd planned 3, enough to see the wall and speak with Mormont and understand what Ned Stark had wanted him to understand. But the North had its own gravity, and on the second morning Jon Snow had taken him ranging in the forest south of the wall with 2 black brothers who knew the terrain, and what Aemon had seen in that forest had extended his stay without discussion. The village was 6 miles south of Castle Black. It had been inhabited as recently as 2 months ago. You could tell by the state of the structures, the goods left behind, the fire pits with ash that hadn't fully scattered. Roughly 40 people, by the estimate of the black brother who knew the area. Wildlings technically on the wrong side of the wall by the Watch's accounting, but real people who'd been living there with the settled permanence of generations. Gone, all of them. No bodies, no blood, just absence, sudden and total, the way a held breath disappears when you breathe out. The black brother with them, a lean, weathered man named Jeremy, crouched beside one of the fire pits and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Third one this season. Third abandoned village," Jon said. He was looking around the tree line with those gray eyes working, reading the space. "Abandoned isn't the word I'd use," Jeremy said. He stood up. "Abandoned is when people leave and take things with them." Aemon looked at the structures, the hooks on walls still holding tools, the blankets on sleeping platforms, the clay cups still on the rough table inside the nearest building. Things you'd take if you had time and intention, things you'd leave if you'd left fast, or if you hadn't left at all. "How far north does this pattern go?" he asked Jeremy. "Far as we've been able to look," Jeremy said, "which isn't as far as it needs to be. We don't have the men to push further north, and Mormont won't risk more rangers until—" He stopped himself, with the expression of a man who said more than he meant to. "Until what?" Aemon said. Jeremy looked at him. "Until someone in the south sends more men." Which was, Aemon understood, not going to happen in any useful time frame given what he'd seen in Sunspear. He stood in the cold, abandoned village and thought about a king who cared about trade routes and a spymaster who cared about dynastic permanence and a political apparatus that had been ignoring ravens from the wall for 3 years, and felt something solidify in him that had been forming since he'd stood at the top of the wall and felt the North look back. On the ride home, Jon said, "You believe it now." "I believed it before," Aemon said. "Now I understand it. There's a difference. Believing is knowing a thing exists. Understanding is knowing what it requires." He looked at the tree lines sliding past them. "It requires the South to stop playing games long enough to look north. Which means someone has to make them look." Jon glanced at him. "Someone, yes." Jon was quiet for a moment, his horse moving beneath him in the rhythm of a canter that he sat easily, naturally, the way people sit horses they've ridden since childhood. "Mormont has been saying that for years," he said. "He's the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, and the South treats his ravens like correspondents from a distant relative who worries too much." "Mormont doesn't have the right name," Aemon said. The words landed in the space between them and sat there. Jon said nothing for the rest of the ride back. It was on the 4th night that Melisandre found him. He hadn't known she was at Castle Black. Mormont hadn't mentioned a Red Priestess in his briefing, and there was no Red Priestess in the garrison's obvious population. She appeared at the door of the hall where Aemon was sitting alone. Jon had gone to the armory to work on something with the castle smith. Sira had retired early with a headache she'd been pretending she didn't have all day, and she stood in the doorway for a moment before coming inside. She was striking in the specific way of people who have arranged themselves to be striking, tall, composed, dressed in red that had no business being that vivid this far north, with hair the color of fire and eyes that were doing something unusual. Not unusual in the way of strangeness, but unusual in the way of someone who is looking at 2 things at once, the visible thing and the thing behind it. "Lord Dayne," she said. She had an accent he couldn't place, not Westerosi, something from further east with vowels that curved differently. "You have the advantage of me," he said. "Melisandre of Ashai." She sat down across from him without invitation, which he didn't mind. "Servant of the Lord of Light." She looked at him the way she'd been looking at him since the doorway, that doubled attention. "I've been at the wall for a month, waiting." "For what?" "For you," she said simply. He held her gaze. She was not a woman given to bluster or manipulation through discomfort. She said what she meant, which he respected regardless of what she meant. "Why?" "Because I have been looking in the flames for 2 years," she said, "for the prince that was promised. Azor Ahai reborn. The one who will stand against the darkness." She held his gaze. "I have seen a sword in the fire and a shield of shadow and a face that could not hold still, that kept changing, that was the fire itself." She paused. "Until 3 days ago when the flames finally showed me something that didn't move." Aemon looked at her steadily. "And you think that's me?" I know it is you. You said that with a great deal of certainty for someone who's speaking to me for the first time. Our Lord does not deal in uncertainty, she said. Only the servants of the Lord of Light are uncertain because we are mortal and our vision is incomplete. She tilted her head slightly. I don't ask you to believe in my God, I ask you to look at what is true, which is. You are the blood of the dragon, she said, born of fire. You carry a sword that was made for you before you were born. You stood at the top of the wall 3 days ago and felt the enemy on the other side of it, and you are the first person to stand at that top and not flinch from what they felt. She said it all plainly, the way you recite facts. These are not articles of faith, they are simply what is. He considered her. She was not afraid of him, she was not afraid of anything, as far as he could tell, which was either genuine spiritual certainty or a very accomplished performance of it. He found himself leaning toward genuine, which made her more interesting than most of the people he'd encountered this month. What does being the prince that was promised actually require? He asked, specifically, not prophecy language, practically. She blinked, which was the first thing she'd done that suggested surprise. Most men ask whether they are the prince that was promised, she said. I'm asking what the job involves. Something moved in her face, not quite amusement, but adjacent. You will face the great other, she said. The darkness beyond the wall, the enemy of fire and life and warmth. You will need to forge a weapon in a specific sacrifice and lead the living against the dead. She paused. The ancient texts describe a hero who drew a burning sword from a fire and tempered it in the heart of one who loved them. Ashara Dayne will not be pleased, Aemon said. Melisandre looked at him. That is not the response I expected. What did you expect? Fear, disbelief, protestations of unworthiness. She studied him. I have delivered this prophecy 4 times in my life, and 3 of those men wept. The prophecy doesn't frighten me, Aemon said. The thing behind the wall does slightly, which is appropriate, because it is genuinely frightening. Prophecy is just, he found the word, information, about what's coming and approximately what it will need. He looked at the fire, the forging the weapon in a loved one's heart. I'm not doing that literally. The texts, I've read the texts, he said, not all of them, but enough. The sacrifice that Azor Ahai made was specific to his time and his weapon. I have Dawn. He touched the hilt. Dawn doesn't need tempering, it was already what it is. Melisandre looked at him for a long time. He let her look. She was deciding something about him, the same way Oberyn had decided something about him, and he had the same patience for it that he'd had then. He had nothing to hide and nothing to perform, and she could take as long as she needed. You are not like anyone I expected, she said finally. What did you expect? A young man I would have to convince, she said it frankly. Someone I would have to build a fire and show visions to. Someone who needed the prophecy to give them permission to be what they already are. I don't need permission, he said. No, she said. Don't. She was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet the fire between them moved in the draft from the door, and the light moved on her face and on his. The dragon has 3 heads, she said. That is also in the old texts. You are not alone in this. I know, he said. He thought about Jon Snow in the armory down the corridor, working on something with careful northern hands. He thought about Daenerys Targaryen somewhere east, whose ships Oberyn had mentioned and whom he'd never met. I know. She looked at the fire for a moment. When she looked back at him, her expression had changed. The priestess quality had receded slightly, and underneath it was something more human and more tired. The night is dark and full of terrors, she said. I've been saying that for 20 years. A pause. It's true. I need you to understand that, not as a ritual phrase, as a statement of fact. What is coming from beyond that wall? She glanced toward the north, toward the wall invisible in the dark. There is nothing in the world of men that has prepared men for it. Then we'll have to prepare anyway, Aemon said. She looked at him one more time. Then she stood and the priestess quality came back and she said, I will stay at the wall for a time. If you need me, I know where to find you, he said. She left him by the fire. He sat with it for a while after she was gone, the prophecy, the fire, the shape of what was coming. He'd known the broad outline of the dragon's myth since Ashara had told him about Rhaegar's belief, but there was a difference between knowing your father believed in something and standing at the edge of the world and feeling it for yourself. The long night, the great other, the dead that wouldn't stay dead. He was 17 years old and the prince that was promised, and he found, when he sat with all of that in the cold of Castle Black's hall, that he was not afraid of it. Not because he didn't understand what it meant, but because understanding what it meant made him want to move toward it rather than away. The same impulse that made him put his hand on the wall's ice and feel what was behind it rather than pull back. He was his mother's son in this. Ashara had never once turned away from a hard thing. He was his father's son in this too, he supposed. Rhaegar had walked toward the reckoning he believed in, even when it cost him everything. The difference, Aemon thought, was that he intended to come out the other side. Jon Snow found him an hour later, back from the armory with oil on his hands and the direct quality of someone who has been thinking while they worked. He stood in the doorway for a moment looking at Aemon by the fire. "The Red Woman came to see you," he said. "She did." Jon came inside and sat down. He said nothing for a moment, the northern way of entering conversations, giving them room to start naturally rather than forcing them. "Then, she came to me first, last week, before you arrived." He looked at the fire. "She looked at me and went very still, and then she said," he stopped, started again. "She said she was looking for the prince that was promised and she thought she found him, but she was wrong. She looked at me like I was the right shape but the wrong substance." His jaw moved. "I didn't know what she meant, and now," Aemon said quietly. Jon looked at him. "Now I think she was half right." He held Aemon's gaze. "I think there's something she sees in me too, something that's adjacent, connected." He paused. "I've felt the wall the way you felt it. I've been feeling it my whole life. I dream about the cold, about the dark, about things that are coming." He was very still. "I'm not the prince that was promised, but I don't think I'm nothing either." "You're not nothing," Aemon said, "not even close." Jon looked at the fire. "Jon," Aemon said, and the name had a weight in it now, a decision. He waited until Jon looked at him. "I know what I am. Ashara told me before I left Sunspear, and I know what Ned Stark kept." Jon's breathing was very controlled and very deliberate for a moment. "I'm not going to tell you," Aemon said, "because Ned Stark should be the one to say it, and because you said you weren't ready to hear it from a stranger." He held Jon's eyes. "But I want you to know that whatever it is, whatever you are, it's not small. It's not a shame. It's not a burden that makes you less." He was direct and certain the way he was direct and certain about everything that mattered. "You and I are two sides of the same thing. I don't know exactly what that means yet, but I know it's true." Jon Snow looked at him for a long time with those gray eyes doing the thing they did, the deep, still processing like water that runs cold and clear, and you can see the bottom, but it's further down than it looks. "Ice and fire," Jon said very quietly. "Yes." "That's a song," Jon said, "old northern song, about two things that should destroy each other learning to be one thing instead." He paused. "Meister Lewin used to sing it." "I thought it was just a song." "Most things that are just songs," Aemon said, "started as something true." Jon sat with that. Then he said, "You should stay another day. I want to show you something north of the wall." He said it with the flat certainty of someone whose instincts he trusts completely. "There's a place the Rangers call the Fist of the First Men. Mormont won't let most people near it, but he'll let us go." "Why will he let us?" Jon looked at him with something that was almost a smile. "Because I asked him and he said yes, and I think—" He stopped. "I think he's been waiting for someone to go look at it who won't come back and pretend they didn't see what they saw." They went the next morning, just the two of them and Jeremy, who went everywhere north of the wall with the fatalistic ease of a man who has decided the wall's other side is just another place. The Fist of the First Men was a round hill that rose from the forest floor like a fist thrust from underground, its top clear of trees, and ringed with the ancient stones of a defensive perimeter built by the first men during the long night 8,000 years ago. Even now, in the pale winter light, it had the quality of a place that remembered things. The stones were arranged in a deliberate pattern that was neither random nor decorative. It was functional, built by people who understood what they were building against. Aemon walked the perimeter of the old ring and felt it the way he'd felt the wall, that frequency in his bones, that sense of something ancient and specific responding to something in him. "There was a battle here," he said, "not a question. 8,000 years ago," Jeremy said, "during the long night. The first men made their last stand here before," he stopped. "Before the children of the forest and the Night's Watch drove them back," Jon finished. He was looking at the stones with an expression Aemon couldn't quite read, recognition, maybe, or something older than recognition. "Mormont found something here 2 months ago," Jon said. He walked to the center of the ring and crouched, pointing at a specific section of ground. The snow was gone here, just a circle of bare earth, and there was— He paused. He said there was writing, old Valyrian. He couldn't read it, but he described the shapes. Did anyone translate it? "He sent a raven to Meister Aemon, the old Meister at the wall. He's 102 years old and still reading." Jon stood. "The translation came back a week ago." He looked at Aemon. "It said the dragon and the wolf, the fire and the ice. When the dead rise, the living must unite, or there will be no living left." The wind moved across the Fist of the First Men, and the stones stood in their ancient ring, and the sky above was gray and endless, and Aemon stood in the middle of all of it, and felt the weight of 8,000 years pressing down on the present like a hand. "The dragon and the wolf," he said. "Targaryen and Stark," Jon said, and the way he said it had the quality of someone who has been working up to saying something out loud for a long time. They looked at each other. Jon Snow, bastard ward of Ned Stark, gray-eyed and northern and carrying in his blood and his face and his quality of attention something that Aemon recognized as half of himself. Aemon Dayne of Starfall, son of Ashara and secret son of a dead prince, carrying in his fire and his composure and his pale sword something that Jon recognized in the same sideways way, the feeling of a mirror that shows you something true. "Say it," Aemon said. "I'm not ready," Jon said. "You're ready," Aemon said. "You've been ready since the village, you just need to say it." Jon looked at the stones, then at the north, the deep dark of the forest, the direction of whatever was coming, then at Aemon. "Lyanna Stark was my mother," he said. It came out with the quality of something being lowered rather than thrown, careful, certain, landing gently. "I've known for a year. I found a letter in Ned's things when he was sick and thought it was. I was looking for a Meister's scroll and he stopped. It was a letter from someone, he couldn't say the name yet. He breathed. It said, 'Protect him. He is our future. Keep him safe until the time is right.'" Aemon waited. "And it was signed," Jon said, "with a dragon." The wind moved. "The time is right," Aemon said, "or nearly." Jon looked at him, the full weight of the gray eyes, everything held in them. "Are you going to tell me who my father was?" "Yes," Aemon said, "Rhaegar Targaryen, the last dragon prince. Lyanna went with him willingly. It was her choice, not a kidnapping. They were married in secret." He said it plainly, without drama. "You're legitimate. You're the heir to the Iron Throne by blood, if the throne means anything. And you're my—" He found himself stopping on the word, not because he doubted it, but because saying it made it real in a new way. "We have the same father," he finished. Jon Snow was very still. Then he sat down on the ancient stones of the fist of the first men like his legs had made a unilateral decision, and put his head in his hands, and Aemon sat beside him and said nothing and let the moment be what it was. Jeremy, who had been standing at the perimeter with the professional tact of a man who understands when conversations are not for him, found something very interesting to look at in the northern tree line. After a while Jon lifted his head and looked at Aemon with something that was grief and something that was fury and something that was, underneath both of those, a very deep relief, the relief of a thing explained, of a weight named, of a secret that had been pressing against the inside of him for a year finally having a shape outside of him too. "Does Ned know you know?" Jon asked. "He knows I know what I am. He probably suspects I've told you." Aemon looked at the stones. "He sent me here." Jon absorbed that. "He sent you to tell me. He sent me to let you find it," Aemon said. "Same as he let me find mine. He's been protecting us. Not as well as my mother protected me. She told me everything and kept me visible and let me build myself around the truth. Ned," he paused fairly. "Ned kept you hidden from the truth as well as from the world. I think he thought he was doing the right thing. He was trying to protect me," Jon said, not entirely without bitterness. "Yes, he was wrong about how." "Yes," Aemon said, "he was." Jon looked at the sky. "So we're brothers," he said. The word came out with a testing quality. He was trying the weight of it. "Half-brothers. Still brothers," Jon said. "Still brothers," Aemon agreed. Something settled between them, not the relief of secrets told, which they just had, but something older and quieter. The specific comfort of not being the only one, of being part of a number greater than one. They sat on the ancient stones while Jeremy politely pretended the north was very interesting, and the wind came down from beyond the wall and the trees moved in it, and somewhere in the dark forest to the north something made no sound at all. The raven from Ashara arrived on the 6th day, and it arrived with urgency in the cramped, precise script she used when she had no time for her usual composure. "Come south." Tywin moved. "Come now." He read it twice, then he went to find Jon. Jon was in the yard sparring with two black brothers with a training sword and winning without appearing to try, and he stopped when he saw Aemon's face and lowered the sword. "I have to go," Aemon said. "What happened?" "I don't know yet." He held the raven's note. "My mother needs me." Jon looked at the note and then at Aemon with the expression of a man making a calculation. "I'm going south," he said. "Jon, I'm not staying at the wall when my brother is riding into something," Jon said, and the word brother came out with the same ease it had on the fist of the first men, like it had always been there and just needed permission. "Mormont will understand. You can't just—" "Watch me," Jon said and walked toward the stables. Aemon looked at the yard around him, the wall over the castle's northern edge, the black brothers going about their business, the raven still in his hand. He thought about Ashara's note, short and hard and urgent, and about Tywin Lannister in the shadow of the royal pavilion with his golden eyes doing their cold arithmetic. He thought about Oberyn saying, "Come back whole, because things are going to move while you're gone." They had moved. He put the note in his pocket and followed Jon to the stables. Melisandre found him at the gate. She didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at him with those eyes that looked at two things simultaneously, and then she said, "The flames showed me your road south last night." And the fire is going with you, she said, which is not a metaphor. She looked at Dawn on his back. The sword will be needed before the end, Lord Dayne, but so will the name. She met his eyes. The world needs to know what you are, not the secret, the truth. I know, he said, you're not afraid of that. She studied him one last time with the particular quality of someone committing a face to memory. The night is dark and full of terrors, she said. Then we'd better get started, Aemon said. He rode through the gate. Behind him, Jon Snow followed on a horse that was too good for the night's watch and that he clearly had no intention of leaving behind. Ahead of them the King's Road ran south, and somewhere at the other end of it, Dorne was moving and Tywin Lannister had made his play and Ashara was managing it alone, and the world was rearranging itself into the shape of the thing that came next. Aemon rode without looking back. The wall diminished behind him and the north opened up ahead of him, and then the north became the south and he was riding toward everything. The truth and the war and the name he'd been building himself into since the first morning he'd picked up Dawn and felt it know him. He was not running toward it. He was riding, which was different, steady, controlled, with direction and intent and the full understanding of what waited at the end. The King's Road stretched ahead and the sky was vast and the sword on his back caught the pale northern light and gave it back as something older and more certain. South, Chapter 6, Dawn breaks, they rode hard. Not recklessly, Aemon knew the difference between urgency and waste, and a lamed horse on the King's Road served no one, but with the sustained, ground-eating pace of riders who understand that the road between where they are and where they need to be is not a journey, it's an obstacle. The 20 Starfall riders fell into the rhythm without complaint. They were garrison men, not lords' escorts, and they rode the way soldiers ride, efficiently, without ceremony, eating in the saddle when they could. Jon Snow rode like he'd been born on horseback, which, in the specific Stark way, he essentially had. He asked no unnecessary questions and made no unnecessary complaints, and when Aemon pushed the pace at a river crossing where the ford was deeper than expected, Jon was already through it before the Starfall riders had properly assessed the depth. Sira rode beside Aemon for the first 2 days and said very little, which was how he knew she'd read the Raven's note and understood what it meant. On the third morning she said, "Tell me what we're riding into." Tywin moved, he said. "I don't know how yet." Best guess, he thought about everything he'd catalogued in Sunspear. Tywin's 4-hour meeting with Dorne, Cersei's calculated attention. The questions being asked through back channels about Ashara and the timing of things 16 years ago. He proposed something to Dorne, Aemon said. Something that involved me. A marriage alliance, maybe, or a political arrangement that required my cooperation. Something that would make me useful to Lannister interests. And if you refused, then being useful to Lannister interests shifts to being dangerous to Lannister interests, he said. And Tywin manages dangerous things the same way he manages everything else. By removing them, Sira said. By removing them. She was quiet for a moment. Your mother can't hold that off alone. She's not alone, Aemon said. She has Oberyn. Sira considered this with the expression of someone recalculating odds. All right, she said. That's better. Yes, Aemon said. It is. Behind them, Jon Snow rode with his grey cloak and his northern sword and the easy competence of a man who had decided where he was going and had no interest in discussing whether it was wise. They made King's Landing in 4 days and didn't stop. Aemon had considered stopping. Ned Stark was there in the capital, serving as the hand of the king after Jon Arryn's death, and there were things that had changed since the wall that Ned needed to know. But Ashara's note had said now, and now meant now. He sent a raven from the inn where they changed horses, addressed to Ned Stark at the Tower of the Hand, and put 3 things in it. I know everything. Jon does too. Tywin moved. Come south when you can. He didn't wait for a response. King's Landing smelled the way it always smelled, too many people in too small a space, the specific alchemy of ambition and waste, and he rode through it without stopping and came out the other side on the road that ran southwest toward the Reach and beyond it Dorne, and he felt the air change by degrees as the days passed. Warmer, drier, the particular quality of light that the south wore like a second skin. Jon Snow's posture shifted as the weather changed, some northern tension in him releasing incrementally as the cold receded. He didn't comment on it, but Aemon saw it and said nothing. The North did things to people who belonged to it, and so did the South, and Jon Snow was experiencing the South for the first time and processing it in the contained northern way, taking it in without showing it, cataloging. On the 5th night out of King's Landing, camped on the edge of the Reach where the land started to go dry and the scrub began to replace the green, Jon sat by the fire and said, "I've been thinking about Ned." "The hand of the king," Aemon said. "He's investigating something," Jon said. "He told me before I left for the wall he was looking into Jon Arryn's death. He thought it wasn't natural." He looked at the fire. Arryn was asking questions before he died about Robert's children. Aemon went still. About whether they were Robert's, Jon said. The fire moved in the night wind. Cersei, Aemon said. Cersei, Jon confirmed. That's what I think, that's what Ned thinks. He looked up. If Arryn died because he found out the Lannister children aren't Robert's, then Ned's in danger, Aemon said. Right now, in King's Landing, investigating the same thing. Yes, they looked at each other across the fire. The raven I sent him, Aemon said. I told him Tywin moved and to come south. He won't come south, Jon said. He'll think he needs to stay. He thinks in terms of duty. A pause. He always thinks in terms of duty. Then he's going to get himself killed by it, Aemon said. Jon's jaw was tight. We can't go back. No, Aemon agreed. We can't, he thought, but we can send another raven, more specific this time. He stood. The innkeeper 2 miles back had birds. I saw the coat. It's the middle of the night. Yes, Aemon said, putting on his cloak. It is. He rode back to the inn in the dark and woke the innkeeper with the specific combination of gold and urgency that made the middle of the night negotiable, and he sent a raven north addressed to Ned Stark that said, simply, Cersei knows you know. Leave King's Landing, do it today, come to Starfall. He rode back to camp under the stars. It was, he knew, probably too late or possibly just in time, and he had no way of knowing which. He filed it in the part of his mind reserved for things he'd done everything he could about, and he let the fire burn down, and he slept. Dorne announced itself the way it always did, aggressively, immediately, without apology. The air changed first, that dry heat with the edge of something floral underneath it that was specific to the Dornish lowlands. Then the stone changed color, red and rust replacing the gray-brown of the reach. Then the plants came in with their Dornish stubbornness, thorns and blooms, alive in the way of things that have been told they shouldn't be alive and have found that information irrelevant. Jon Snow looked at the landscape with unconcealed interest. It's like another country, he said. It is another country, Sira said. It's Dorne, it does what it likes. The people, too, said one of the Starfall riders, a man named Edwell who had strong opinions about Dornish identity. 300 years the dragons couldn't touch us, we do things our way. Jon took this in with the northern equanimity that was becoming familiar. I like it, he said, which was the same thing Aemon had said about the north, and Aemon noticed the parallel without commenting on it. They reached the Tor by midday in Starfall by the following evening, coming down the long road toward the castle with the Torrentine running alongside them and the summer sea visible ahead, and Aemon felt the loosening of something he'd been holding tight since Ashara's raven, the specific relief of approach, of the destination finally being more present than absent. Starfall's gates were open. That was normal. Starfall was not a fortress on a war footing, not in times of general peace, but there were more guards at the walls than there should have been, and they were alert in the way of men who had been on heightened watch for several days. Aemon rode in. Ashara was in the courtyard. She looked at him with a relief she let him see, which meant things had been genuinely difficult in ways she'd been managing alone, and then her eyes moved past him to Jon Snow, and the calculation in her face was immediate and complete, and she held it without showing what she made of it. Inside, she said, all of you, we have things to discuss. She told it plainly, which was her way. Tywin Lannister had proposed, through Dorne, a marriage alliance. The proposed match, Aemon Dayne to Miachella Baratheon. On the surface it was a compliment. Miachella was the king's daughter, and offering her to a Dornish lord was an acknowledgement of standing. Underneath it was something else entirely. It was a leash. A Lannister daughter in name, everyone knew Robert's children were Cersei's children in fact. Tied to Aemon's house would put Aemon directly under Lannister observation, remove him from Dorne's political sphere in any meaningful way, and most importantly, give Tywin proximity to the boy he was increasingly certain was something other than a Dayne bastard. Dorne considered it for 2 days, Ashara said, which is faster than Dorne usually considers anything, which means he was either tempted or alarmed. Which was it? Aemon asked. Both, Oberyn said from the chair in the corner where he'd been sitting since they arrived, with Alleria on the bench beside him and the expression of a man who has spent the past fortnight in a state of barely managed fury. He was tempted because the alliance itself isn't without value. He was alarmed because he understood what Tywin was actually doing. He looked at Aemon. He declined, but not before Tywin made clear that the declining was noted. What does noted mean, coming from Tywin Lannister? Sira asked. It means he filed it, Aemon said, and started working on a different approach. A different approach arrived 2 days after the declination, Ashara said, not through Dorne this time, through a different channel. She met Aemon's eyes. A Lannister agent in Sunspear, we don't know who yet, Oberyn's people are looking, began asking questions about Ashara Dayne's history at court, specifically about the period around the Tower of Joy. specifically about how old her son was and who had been present at Starfall in the months before and after the war. "He's building a case," Jon said. Everyone looked at him. He was sitting with his arms resting on his knees and his face doing the stark thinking thing, still and careful and working through it. He doesn't know yet, he suspects. He's collecting evidence to confirm the suspicion before he acts on it, because Tywin Lannister doesn't act on suspicion, he acts on certainty. Ashara looked at Jon Snow with full attention for the first time. "You're Ned's ward," she said. "Yes, my lady. Jon Snow. Yes." She held his gaze for a long moment. He held it back without discomfort, which she registered. "You know what you are," she said, not a question. "Yes," Jon said. "Aemon told me." "I told him at the Fist of the First Men," Aemon said. "He already knew half of it, I just gave him the other half." Ashara looked at her son, and the look had several layers, pride in something that was not quite reproach, more like the acknowledgement that things had moved faster than she'd planned and that she was deciding whether fast was bad or just different from slow. "Ned's in King's Landing," Jon said. "He's the hand of the king and he's investigating the Lannisters and he's in danger." "I know," Ashara said. "I've been in contact with him." "He won't leave," Jon said, "not voluntarily." "No," Ashara said, "he won't." She looked at the room. "Is why what we do in the next 2 weeks needs to happen before Cersei acts, because once Cersei acts against Ned—" She stopped. "The board changes entirely." Oberyn stood. He'd been sitting with unusual stillness for Oberyn, and when he stood the energy in the room changed the way it always changed when he stopped containing himself. "I have been patient," he said, with the specific quality of a man who has been patient well past his natural tolerance for it. "I've been patient for 15 years. I've been patient while the man who murdered my sister sat on a throne. I've been patient while Dorne played his game at the pace of stones." He looked at Aemon. "I am finished being patient. What do you want to do?" Aemon said. "I want to make it impossible to ignore," Oberyn said. "I want to put the truth in a room where everyone can see it, and I want to watch Tywin Lannister try to manage something that can't be managed through back channels and planted agents." He was looking at Aemon with the expression he'd worn at the tournament, the completed decision. "I want to tell the world what you are." The room was very still. "Not to everyone," Ashara said immediately. "Not all at once, we don't have the position for that yet." "Dorne," Oberyn said. "Just Dorne first, but all of Dorne." He held Aemon's eyes. "You call the bannermen. You come to Sunspear, you stand in the great hall and you tell them, not with a proclamation, not with a herald, but in the way a man tells a room who he is when he's not afraid of them." He paused. "And you bring dawn." "I always bring dawn," Aemon said. "Good." Oberyn's smile came back, that ferocious specific thing. "Then let's get started." The ravens went out that evening. Not many, targeted, specific. The lords of Dorne whose support meant something, and whose discretion could be counted on for the 10 days they needed to get everyone in the same room. Oberyn wrote most of them himself, in the code he and Dorne had used since they were young men, and Aemon sat with him while he wrote and read each one and said what he thought, and Oberyn listened to what he said, which was something Oberyn didn't do with most people. Jon Snow spent the evening with Sir Edric, who had taken one look at him on arrival and gone straight to weapons instructor mode with the ease of a man who had a single primary response to unfamiliar young men, which was to hand them something heavy and sharp and see what they did with it. Jon had done something that made Sir Edric go very quiet and then very loud, which Aemon recognized as the progression of Sir Edric encountering someone who was genuinely good. "He fights like a Stark," Sir Edric reported, appearing in the doorway of the study where Aemon and Oberyn were working. "All north, all straight lines and power." "Is that a problem?" Aemon asked. "It's a style," Sir Edric said with the specific emphasis of a man who has opinions about styles. "Not a problem. Different architecture, he and you are going to make an interesting pair." "That's the idea," Aemon said. Sir Edric looked at him for a moment. "You know I've known something was off about your parentage since you were 12. "I know," Aemon said, "and you didn't think to, you didn't ask," Aemon said pleasantly. Sir Edric made a sound that was not quite a word and went back to the yard. Oberyn looked at Aemon. "He's going to be unbearable when it's confirmed," he said. "He's been unbearable since I beat the practice post," Aemon said. "This will just give him new material." Ashara found him on the eastern tower that night. He was where he always was when he needed to think, high up, looking at the water, the Torrentine running below, and the summer sea ahead. The stars were doing their southern thing, which after a week of northern sky looked almost excessive, and the wind off the water was warm and smelled of salt. She sat beside him and they looked at the water together for a while. "Are you ready?" she asked. "Yes, that was fast. I've been ready," he said. "You've been the one deciding when the timing was right." She was quiet. "I know. You were right to wait," he said, before she could feel the need to defend it. If we'd done this a year ago, 6 months ago, I wouldn't have been to the wall. I wouldn't have understood what's coming. I wouldn't have met John. He looked at the sea. The timing was right. You knew it and Oberyn knew it, and I think Ned knew it too, which is why he came south when he did. Robert is going to be furious, Ashara said. Yes, and dangerous. Yes, Aemon said, but Robert's anger is loud. Loud things announce themselves. He touched Dawn's hilt in the absent way he always did when he was thinking. It's Tywin I watch. Tywin won't make a move against a declared claimant with Dorne behind him, Ashara said. Not directly, he'll look for the indirect route. Then we take the indirect routes away from him, Aemon said, one by one, which starts in Sunspear. She was quiet for a moment. I'm proud of you, she said, not because of what you are by blood, because of who you've become regardless of it. She said it simply, without ornamentation, the way she said all the things that mattered most. Arthur would have been proud, and I genuinely believe that Lyanna would have been proud. He didn't say anything for a moment. He thought about Ned Stark saying she would have been proud at the tournament, and about the tuneless whistle and the younger sister who beat her brother at swords and refused to believe it was luck. He thought about Rhaegar, whom Oberyn had described in pieces, the serious man with the harp and the prophecy, and the burning certainty of someone who'd seen something the rest of the world couldn't. Tell me something about her, he said, about Lyanna. She used to ride out at night, Ashara said. When she was at court before everything, she didn't like the castle at night. She said it felt like being buried. She'd take a horse and go out on the road just to feel the air. A pause. She told me that the North was the most honest place she'd ever been because it never pretended to be anything other than what it was. She looked at the sea. I think you have that in you, the northern honesty. You never pretend to be anything other than what you are. You made me that way, he said. I gave you the conditions for it, she said. You made yourself. They sat on the eastern tower of Starfall while the Torrentine ran below them and the summer sea breathed in the dark, and the stars turned overhead in the Dornish way, too many and too bright and entirely unconcerned with what was happening beneath them. The lords of Dorne came to Sunspear over 9 days. Not all of them, this was not a formal call, and some couldn't travel in the time given, but enough. The Ironwoods came, which surprised Aemon, until Oberyn told him that Sir Cletus had been talking about the tournament since the day it ended, and had apparently been making his own calculation. The Danes of High Hermitage, distant cousins, came with 12 riders and the specific family expression that said they'd been waiting for something like this for longer than Aemon had been alive. Fowler, Vaith, Jordan, Manwoody, the great lords of Dorne arriving in ones and twos, receiving the same message in the same code, assembling in Sunspear with the accumulated patience of people who have been playing a long game and are ready for it to end. Doran was waiting. He received Aemon in his personal chambers before the assembly, just the two of them, Doran in his chair, the morning light coming through the windows of the Tower of the Sun. He looked at Aemon with the deep-water gaze and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "You're going to do this?" "Yes," Aemon said, "without my permission." "I'm asking for your support," Aemon said. "Not your permission. I don't need permission to say who I am." Doran looked at him for another long moment. Then something moved in his face, the deepest water surface changing. A small adjustment that said something enormous was shifting underneath. "I have been playing this game since before you were born," he said. "I've been planning it since Elia died, since her children died." He said their names without saying them, which was more present than saying them. "Every choice I've made has been in service of a reckoning that I intended to bring about on my own timeline and in my own way. And," Aemon said, "and my brother has been telling me for 3 years that my timeline is wrong," Doran said, "that the world moves faster than I account for." He was looking at Aemon with something that might, in a different man's face, have been the beginning of a smile. "You are 17 years old and you've spent the last month meeting Jon Snow at the Wall and making friends with a Red Priestess, and somehow convincing Oberyn to assemble the Lords of Dorne in 9 days, which I didn't think was possible." "The Lords of Dorne assembled themselves," Aemon said. "I just gave them a direction." "Yes," Doran said, "that's exactly what a good ruler does." He folded his hands in his lap. "I'll support you. Dorne will stand behind you, not because I think this will be easy or clean or without cost." He held Aemon's eyes. "But because what is coming, what Melisandre spoke of, what the ravens from the wall have been saying, what you felt when you stood up there and looked north, that requires a different kind of leadership than the kind I've been providing." "I'm not replacing you," Aemon said. "I don't want Dorne's seat." "I know," Doran said. "That's part of why I'm trusting you with this." He nodded toward the door. "Go, they're waiting." The great hall of the Spear Tower held the Lords of Dorne the way it held feasts, with the organized chaos of too many important people and too many opinions, arranged into something that looked like order from a distance and was really just managed tension up close. Aemon walked in. He addressed simply, dark red, the Dane colors, nothing elaborate, dawn on his back. No crown, no herald, no formal processional. He walked in through the side door rather than the main entrance because the main entrance was for ceremony, and this wasn't ceremony, it was a conversation. The room was loud when he entered. It was quieter by the time he reached the center of it, because word moved through groups of people like water through sand, fast and silent and inevitable. And by the time he stopped and turned to face them, the hall was about 3/4 quiet, the remaining noise dying off in patches as people registered what was happening. Oberyn was standing at the edge of the room with Elaria and his daughters, and the expression of a man who has been waiting for this his entire adult life and is choosing to feel it fully rather than protect himself from the feeling. Ashara was beside Dorne. Jon Snow was at the back of the hall near the wall, present but not prominent, because that was his choice and Aemon had respected it. This was Aemon's moment, and Jon had said simply, "I'll be there," and left it at that. Aemon looked at the assembled lords of Dorne. "I'm not going to make a speech," he said. His voice was even and carried well, not because he was projecting, just because the hall was quiet and he spoke clearly. "I'm going to tell you something true, and then I'm going to tell you what it means, and then you're going to tell me what you think." He had their attention completely. "My name is Aemon. I was born at the Tower of Joy 16 years ago to Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen. Ashara Dayne brought me to Starfall and raised me as her son, which she was and is and will always be. The blood I carry is Targaryen and Stark. I am the last child of the Dragon Prince." He said it all with the same tone he'd used at the tournament to stop Joffrey, conversational, direct, finished. "I am not telling you this because I want a throne. I'm telling you this because secrets at this scale kill people, and the people they kill are rarely the ones who deserve it." A sound moved through the hall, not disagreement, not opposition, but the specific quality of a large group of people processing something together. "There is something coming from beyond the wall," he said. "Something that makes everything in this hall, the alliances, the marriages, the trade routes, the old debts and older grievances, look like exactly what they are, which is people arguing about furniture while the house is on fire." He looked at the room. "Robert Baratheon is on a throne that was built on the deaths of Elia Martell's children. That's real, and it matters, and Dorne will have its reckoning for it. It matters after the thing coming from the north, because if we don't deal with that first, there won't be anyone left to have reckonings." Lord Ironwood said from his seat, "You're asking us to unite behind a name that Robert Baratheon will want dead the moment he hears it." "I'm asking you to unite behind a truth," Aemon said. "Robert Baratheon's desire to manage that truth is his problem, not mine. It becomes our problem when he marches south. Then we'll be ready when he does," Aemon said. "Dorne held against the dragons for a century. It can hold against a man who was a hammer 20 years ago and is now just a heavy thing." A beat of silence. Then Sir Cletus Ironwood laughed, the same big laugh he'd had when he lost the tournament final, genuine and uncomplicated, and it broke something in the room, and several other voices followed, and the specific noise of a room moving from tension to momentum began to fill the spear tower of Sunspear. Oberyn, at the room's edge, said nothing. He was looking at Aemon with the expression he'd worn at the tournament when Aemon had stopped Joffrey with 8 words, multiplied by a factor of something that had no mathematical expression. Pride and satisfaction, and the vindication of a 15-year conviction held against everything that said it was too long and too costly. Ashara was looking at him the same way. Aemon stood in the middle of the Lords of Dorne and let the moment settle around him and said, "Questions." The questions took 3 hours. They were good questions. The Lords of Dorne were not people who accepted a situation without stress-testing every surface, and they came at it from every angle. Proof, succession law, the practicalities of Robert's response, the northern angle, the question of Daenerys Targaryen somewhere to the east, the role of the Night's Watch, the White Walkers themselves. One older lord from the Boneway who had read more than most had a 15-minute exchange with Aemon about the ancient texts describing the long night that was one of the most substantive conversations Aemon had had about it outside of Mormont. Jon Snow stayed at the back of the hall for the first 2 hours. In the third hour, when the discussion shifted to the northern threat and someone said, "But who speaks for the north?" Jon walked forward through the assembled lords with the unhurried directness of a man who has decided something and is done deliberating about it, and he stood beside Aemon and said, "I do." The room looked at him. "Jon Snow," he said, "born of Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen, raised in the north by Eddard Stark, who knew the truth and kept it to keep us safe." He said it without hesitation, without drama, with the flat northern honesty that was as different from Aemon's Dornish directness as the wall was from the summer sea, and just as immovable. The North and the Dragon and the Watch, all pointing at the same thing, all telling the same story. He looked at the assembled lords. The long night is coming, and when it does, you want the Dragon Prince and his brother standing at the wall rather than arguing about furniture. Silence. Then Oberyn Martell stood up from his chair at the room's edge, which drew every eye because Oberyn standing up always drew every eye, and said, "Are we decided?" The lords of Dorne decided. 3 days later, the raven came from King's Landing. Aemon read it in the small hours of the morning, unable to sleep, sitting on the eastern tower of Starfall with the stars and the water and the habit of 16 years. The message was in Ned Stark's handwriting, cramped and urgent at the edges in a way that Ned's usual controlled script never was. Arrested, Cersei moved, I am in the black cells. Do not come to King's Landing, it is what they want. Sansa and Arya are in the city, get them out. Whatever you do next, do it fast. Robert is dead. I received your raven too late, I'm sorry. He read it 3 times. Robert Baratheon was dead. Ned Stark was in the black cells. Joffrey Lannister was about to be declared king. He held the raven's note in the dark of the eastern tower and looked at the sea, and the sea looked back with its usual vast indifference, and Aemon thought very clearly and very quickly through the shape of what came next. Joffrey on the throne meant Cersei beside it and Tywin behind it. It meant the Lannister consolidation happening at speed, without Robert's size and chaos making space for other people to maneuver. It meant Ned Stark on the block unless someone stopped it. It meant the North rudderless at exactly the moment it needed a direction. It meant the furniture was actively on fire. He went to wake Oberyn first, because Oberyn's mind at the 3rd hour of the morning was sharper than most men's minds at noon. Oberyn read the note in the light of a single candle, and his face went through several things very quickly. Grief, which surprised Aemon to see on Oberyn because it wasn't an emotion he associated with the Prince of Dorne in this context. But of course Ned Stark was not nothing to Oberyn. Ned was connected to Ilya, to Arthur, to the whole tangled history, and then fury, and then the cold calcification of fury into purpose. Sansa and Arya Stark, Oberyn said. Yes. We need people in King's Landing. I have people in King's Landing, Oberyn said, already moving. He did, of course he did. The snake had been putting people in difficult rooms for 20 years. Within an hour, ravens were flying north and east and to King's Landing with Oberyn's specific signature, and Jon Snow was awake and dressed and white around the mouth with something that was not quite grief and not quite panic and was, Aemon understood, the experience of a person whose family is in danger and who has never experienced that from a distance before. We get them out, Aemon said. Oberyn's contacts in the city, it's already in motion. And Ned is, he stopped, thought. Ned is Cersei's bargaining chip. She won't kill him yet. She'll want the North's submission first. She won't get it, Jon said. No, Aemon said, she won't. Jon looked at him. What are you going to do? Aemon looked south toward the coast, where the Torrentine met the sea, where the morning was still hours away, but the sky had that quality of a held breath that preceded it. He thought about Melisandre at the wall saying the flames showed me your road south. He thought about Oberyn saying I want to watch Tywin try to manage something that can't be managed through back channels. He thought about Doran saying what is coming requires a different kind of leadership. He thought about the ships Oberyn had mentioned weeks ago, the night they'd stood on the rampart at Sunspear and talked about Rhaegar. Daenerys' ship's on the horizon. How far out is she? He said. Oberyn appeared in the doorway behind Jon as if summoned. The last report put her fleet 2 weeks east, he said. She has 3 dragons and a Dothraki Khalasar and a Westerosi army's worth of freed slaves from Essos, and she is coming here. He paused. I've been in contact with her for 8 months. Aemon looked at him. Someone had to be, Oberyn said without a hint of apology. Does she know about me? She knows there is a nephew, Oberyn said. She knows he's alive and that he's in Dorne and that he is, by the account of every person who's met him, someone worth knowing. He looked at Aemon directly. I told her to come. I told her Dorne would receive her, and I told her she was not coming to reclaim a throne, she was coming home. Aemon absorbed this. She has dragons, Jon said. Yes, Oberyn said. 3 of them. Yes. Jon looked at Aemon with the gray eyes doing their deep processing. The dragon has 3 heads, he said. I know, Aemon said. You meet her. I know. That's, Jon stopped. We've never met her. No, Aemon said. We haven't. He walked past both of them to the eastern tower, which was where he always went, and he stood at the parapet as the first edge of dawn began its approach, not visible yet but present, the sky doing its preliminary work, the darkness going from black to something almost blue at the horizon over the water. He looked east. Somewhere out there, 2 weeks over the water, his aunt was coming with fire and ships and the kind of force that changed the conversation entirely. Somewhere north, the dead were moving and the wall was standing, and the night's watch was burning ravens into the southern sky and being ignored. Somewhere in King's Landing, Ned Stark was in a cell and two northern girls were in a city that had just turned dangerous. The world was burning its furniture. He heard Jon come to stand beside him, and then Oberyn on the other side, and then Ashara's step. He always knew her step, and she stood at his shoulder. The four of them at the parapet of Starfall, looking east. The sky was doing it now, the pale line at the horizon brightening, the darkness retreating in increments, the water going from black to the first dark blue of a morning not yet arrived. In a few minutes the sun would come over the edge of the world, and the summer sea would light up gold, and the day would be whatever the day was going to be. Aemon looked at the horizon. He had been born in a tower at the end of a war, to a dying mother and a dead father, and a world that would have killed him if it had known he existed. He had been carried out of that tower by a woman who had lost everything and chosen him anyway, and carried south into the sun, and raised in the light of a famous name and a legendary sword, and a love that had never once been conditional. He had spent 17 years becoming the thing that the world would need when it finally got desperate enough to look. He was ready. Dawn was always a beginning rather than an end. He had known that about the sword since the first morning he'd held it. He knew it about the time too, this exact hour, the dark before the sun, the moment when everything was still becoming rather than already being. He put his hand on the hilt and felt the blade's ancient response, that specific warmth that was not the warmth of metal in a hand but something older, something that recognized what it was held by. Below in the castle he could hear Sir Edric's voice beginning its morning complaints. The garrison stirring, horses, the sound of a world waking up. The horizon went gold. "All right," Aemon said. He said it quietly to all of them and to none of them, to the sea and the morning and the dragons coming over the water, and the dead moving in the north, and the burning city, and the girl in the east who didn't know yet that she had a nephew waiting at the edge of the world with a pale sword, and no intention whatsoever of making anything easy for the people who thought they'd won. The sun broke over the horizon. Dawn caught it the way it always caught the light, transforming it, making it into something that wasn't light anymore, but was whatever light became when it passed through something made for exactly this purpose. Aemon Dayne, son of Starfall and son of fire and son of ice, turned his face into the morning and let it be real. Everything was about to begin.